The first time my husband told me he was leaving, he didn't even have the decency to sit down. He stood in the middle of our living room with a leather suitcase beside him, one hand tucked casually into the pocket of an expensive coat I didn't remember buying. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains we'd picked out together nearly 10 years earlier, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. It looked like any ordinary evening. It wasn't. I didn't plan for it to happen this way, Daniel said. I stared at him, waiting for the rest. When it didn't come, I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because my brain refused to believe what my ears had just heard. What way? I asked quietly. He sighed as if I were making this difficult. I'm leaving. Silence filled the room. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than I'd ever noticed before. Tick. 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 Somewhere upstairs, our daughter was humming while finishing her homework. She had no idea that her world was about to change forever. I folded the towel I'd been holding and placed it neatly on the kitchen counter. For work? New? I looked at the suitcase. Then back at him. No. He shook his head. I'm leaving you. The words landed without emotion, flat, carefully rehearsed, almost professional. I searched his face for something, anything. Regret, fear, sadness. Instead, I found relief, as though he'd finally crossed something off his to-do list. Is there someone else? He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. I closed my eyes for a moment. When? A few months. A few months. I didn't mean for it to happen. No, I whispered. You just meant for it to continue. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Emily, please don't make this ugly. Ugly. The word echoed inside my head. Our marriage was ending, and he was worried about ugly. I looked around the room. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every memory. We had built this little house one paycheck at a time. We had painted these walls ourselves. We had celebrated birthdays here, Christmas mornings, snow days. Late talks after our daughter fell asleep. Now he was walking away as though none of it had ever mattered. Who is she? He hesitated, then answered, Victoria. The name meant nothing, until he continued. Victoria Sinclair. Even I recognized the surname. Sinclair Technologies. One of the wealthiest families in the country. The kind of people whose names appeared in magazines. People who owned buildings instead of renting apartments. People who traveled by private jet because airports were inconvenient. I blinked. You're leaving your wife, Emily, for a billionaire. She's successful. I couldn't help smiling, not because I was happy, because the situation had become so unbelievable it almost sounded fictional. So that's what this is. It isn't about money. I raised an eyebrow. It isn't? Nope. Then why mention she's successful? He looked away. I've realized I want something different. Different. I've worked hard my entire life, so have I. You know what I mean? No. I want opportunities. We've had opportunities. I want more. There it was. Finally. Honesty. Not love. Not compatibility. More. He wanted more. Bigger house. Better vacations. Luxury cars. Exclusive parties. The life we'd laughed about whenever glossy magazines showed impossible lifestyles. Apparently, he hadn't been laughing. I love her. The sentence barely registered. Not because it hurt less. Because everything else already hurt too much. I see. He nodded. I'm glad you understand. I almost laughed again. Understand? No. Accept? Maybe. Understand? Never. Does she know you have a daughter? Of course. And she's okay with that? Emily. It's a simple question. Yes. I looked upstairs. Our daughter was still humming. She loved music. She believed every family ate dinner together. She believed every promise adults made lasted forever. How do you explain betrayal to a child? You don't. You simply watch innocence disappear. Daniel followed my gaze. I'll still be part of her life. I looked back at him. Will you? Of course. The same way you've been part of this marriage these past few months. His jaw tightened. I knew this would become an argument. No. I shook my head. An argument requires two people fighting for something. I took a slow breath. I'm not fighting for someone who has already left. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. You aren't going to yell? No. Cry. Not in front of you. He seemed disappointed, almost confused. Perhaps he'd prepared himself for screaming, thrown dishes, accusations. Instead, he got silence. Sometimes silence says far more. I've arranged an apartment. I'm sure you have. Victoria helped. I'm sure she did. He shifted awkwardly. I'll send money. The words landed harder than everything else. Send money. As though I were becoming an obligation. An expense. I don't need charity. It's child support. Our daughter deserves a father. I'll be there. I didn't answer. Promises had become meaningless. He picked up the suitcase. I should go. I nodded. Okay. He frowned. That's it. What would you like me to say? I don't know. Neither did I. Maybe there weren't words big enough. He walked toward the front door. His hand rested on the handle. Then he looked back. You'll be okay. I smiled sadly. I know. He seemed surprised. I always am. The front door opened, closed, and just like that, 12 years disappeared behind the sound of a latch clicking shut. I stood motionless. Not because I couldn't move. Because moving would make it real. A few moments later, small footsteps echoed across the upstairs hallway. Dad, I swallowed. Another set of footsteps. Then our daughter appeared halfway down the staircase. Where's Daddy going? I forced a smile. He had to leave. For work. Something like that. She looked toward the front window. I didn't get to hug him. Neither did I. She frowned. When's he coming home? I couldn't answer. Not honestly. So I did the only thing a parent sometimes can. I hugged her. Tightly. She wrapped her little arms around my waist. You smell like cookies. I baked earlier. Can we have one? I nodded. Absolutely. We sat together in the kitchen eating chocolate chip cookies while pretending everything was normal. Children have an incredible ability to believe adults. She believed my smile. She believed everything would be okay. I prayed one day it actually would be. 3 days later, the divorce papers arrived. Efficient, neatly organized. Prepared by one of the city's most expensive law firms. Victoria's influence was already obvious. Every page looked polished. Clinical. As though 12 years could be dissolved with signatures and legal terminology. I signed. Not because I wanted to. Because holding on to someone determined to leave only guarantees more pain. Weeks passed. Life became measured by bills. Mortgage. Utilities. School expenses. Groceries. Every dollar suddenly mattered. I picked up additional shifts at the neighborhood bookstore. The owner, Mrs. Franklin, never asked questions. She simply handed me more hours. Sometimes kindness arrives quietly. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while reorganizing the history section, an elderly gentleman entered carrying a folded umbrella. He wore a navy overcoat, polished shoes, silver hair, kind eyes. He wandered the shelves slowly, studying every title. Eventually, he approached the counter holding an old hardcover novel. I've been looking for this edition for years. You found the last copy. He smiled. Seems today's my lucky day. Or excellent timing. I prefer excellent timing. His smile widened. You work here full-time? Mostly? You like books. I love them. Why? The question caught me off guard. I thought for a moment. Because stories remind us people survive impossible things. He looked at me carefully. As though you know. I think everyone knows eventually. He purchased the book without another question. Before leaving, he paused at the door. I'll see you again. I hope so. So do I. He stepped into the rain. I watched him disappear beneath the gray afternoon sky. I had no way of knowing that quiet conversation would change the course of my entire life. because the man who had just walked out wasn't simply another customer. He was Arthur Whitmore, one of the richest and most respected businessmen in America. And for reasons I couldn't possibly understand, he had just become interested in the woman everyone else believed had lost everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, let me know where you're watching from and what you think Daniel's biggest mistake was. Your comments help shape the community around stories like this, and if you enjoy emotional dramas with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. Fire. The first bill arrived exactly 8 days after Daniel left. Not the mortgage. Not the utilities. It was the credit card statement. The one we'd always paid together. I opened the envelope while standing at the kitchen counter, expecting the usual balance. Instead, my stomach tightened. Several purchases had been made only days before Daniel moved out. A designer watch, luxury luggage, an expensive restaurant, jewelry, more than $8,000. I stared at the total. Those weren't accidental purchases. They were preparations. He hadn't simply decided to leave. He had planned his new life while pretending ours still mattered. I slowly folded the statement and slipped it back into the envelope before my daughter wandered into the kitchen. Some truths could wait. Others couldn't. Morning, Mom. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes before climbing onto one of the kitchen stools. Good morning, sweetheart. Are pancakes happening today? I smiled despite everything. They're always happening. But she grinned. Best mom ever. Those 4 words somehow made every sleepless night worth surviving. While the pancakes cooked, she talked excitedly about school. A science project. A spelling test. A friend who wanted to trade stickers. She spoke with the effortless joy only children possess. For 20 precious minutes. There was no divorce. No unpaid bills. No betrayal. Only breakfast. The illusion ended after I dropped her at school. My phone rang before I even reached the parking lot. Mrs. Carter. Speaking. This is Sandra from First National Mortgage. My heart sank. We noticed this month's payment hasn't been received. I know. I wanted to check before any late fees were applied. I'm working on it. There was a brief silence. I understand, Mrs. Carter. Just please contact us before the end of next week. Theth. I will. Thank you. The call ended. I sat in my aging sedan for several minutes staring through the windshield. For 12 years. I'd never missed a payment. Not once. Now one missed paycheck threatened everything. I started the engine and drove toward the bookstore. Mrs. Franklin looked up as I unlocked the front door. You look tired. I've looked worse. She smiled sympathetically. I've added another 15 hours to your schedule. You didn't have to. I know. She handed me an apron. But I wanted to. I swallowed hard. Thank you. No speeches. She pointed toward the shelves. The mystery section lost another battle with enthusiastic customers. I laughed. I'll rescue it. Books became therapy. Shelving them. Organizing them. Helping customers find stories. Each conversation offered a few moments where my own problems faded into the background. Around lunchtime, the front door chimed. The elderly gentleman from earlier in the week stepped inside carrying another umbrella. Arthur. He immediately recognized me. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I finished the novel. In 3 days. It was impossible to put down. I smiled. I know the feeling. He wandered toward the history section before returning with 2 books. You recommended history over biographies. I did. Va. You were right. I usually am. He laughed. I like confidence. I call it experience. Arthur rested both books on the counter. You look exhausted. I hesitated. Long week. They usually are. He didn't pry. He simply nodded. Life has a habit of testing people. It certainly does. And, what? Are you passing? I thought about that. I haven't quit. His eyes softened. Sometimes that's enough. After paying, he remained standing near the register. You have a daughter. I blinked. I noticed the drawing beside your register. I looked toward the colorful picture taped to the cash register. A stick-figure family. Mom. Me. A little girl. One empty space where a fourth person had once been. I hadn't found the courage to remove it. She's 8. A wonderful age. It is. You must be proud. I am? His smile grew warmer. She must be proud of you too. Something proud in my throat. No one had said that to me in a very long time. That evening another surprise arrived. Daniel. He knocked on the front door just after sunset. Our daughter raced across the living room. Daddy? She threw herself into his arms. For a brief second, everything looked normal again. He hugged her tightly. I missed you. I missed you too. She talked endlessly while showing him her latest school project. I stood quietly in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes. Daniel eventually walked over. Can we talk? We're talking. I mean, privately. I glanced toward our daughter. 5 minutes. We stepped onto the back porch. The cool evening air felt strangely peaceful. I transferred some money. I saw. It isn't enough. No. I'm trying. I studied him. His expensive coat, new shoes, luxury watch. You seem to be trying comfortably. His shoulders slumped. It isn't like that. Then tell me what it's like. He looked away. Victoria doesn't think I should keep coming here. I stared at him. What? She says it confuses things. Confuses what? Our daughter. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our daughter isn't confused because you visit. I stepped closer. She's confused because you disappeared. I didn't disappear. You moved into another woman's penthouse. His face tightened. I knew this would happen. What? You'd make everything about Victoria. I almost laughed. Daniel. I shook my head slowly. You already made everything about Victoria. Silence settled between us. Finally he sighed. I'll keep helping financially. I'd rather you kept your promises. He had no answer. Inside the house our daughter called his name. He looked toward the window. I should go. She'll ask when you're coming back. I know. What should I tell her? He didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. Across the city, Daniel stepped into Victoria's penthouse overlooking the skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Marble floors. Modern artwork worth more than my house. Victoria sat beside the fireplace reviewing financial reports on a tablet. You're late. I stopped by my old house. Our agreement was weekends. It wasn't a visit. She finally looked up. It looked like one on the security report. You, Daniel frowned. You had someone watching? I like knowing where people are. You had me followed? She stood calmly. I verified. His expression changed. This feels excessive. She smiled politely. We'll live differently now. He looked around the luxurious apartment. For the first time, it felt less like freedom, and more like a beautifully decorated prison. The following week brought another setback. The bank denied my request to refinance the mortgage. My second job barely covered groceries. The bookstore helped, but it wasn't enough. Late Friday afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in my car outside the bank, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying not to cry. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Arthur stood outside holding an umbrella. I quickly wiped my eyes before lowering the window. I didn't expect to find my favorite bookseller here. I forced a smile. Neither did I. He looked toward the bank. Everything all right? I considered lying. Instead, I'm trying to keep my house. He nodded slowly, not with pity, with understanding. Life can change very quickly. It already has. Arthur leaned lightly against the car. You know, when I was younger, I believed strength meant never needing help. And now I think strength means accepting that difficult seasons eventually end. I smiled faintly. I hope you're right. I know I am. There was something about his confidence, not arrogance. Certainty, like someone who had survived storms far worse than mine. Before leaving, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small business card. There may come a day when you need this. I glanced down. It simply read as Arthur Whitmore. No company. No title. Just a name. I appreciate it. If that day comes due. He smiled kindly. Don't hesitate. I watched him disappear into the evening rain once again, still believing he was simply a retired gentleman who loved books. I had no idea the card in my hand belonged to one of the most influential businessmen in America, nor did I realize that my darkest days were quietly leading me toward a future I could never have imagined. The woman Daniel believed he'd left with nothing was about to meet the man who would change everything. The business card stayed in my purse for nearly 2 weeks. Not because I had forgotten about it, because I couldn't bring myself to use it. Every time I reached for my wallet, I saw the simple white card tucked inside. Z. Arthur Whitmore. Z. Nothing else. No company. No title. No address. Just a name. Most people filled business cards with accomplishments. Arthur's told me absolutely nothing. In a strange way, that made me trust him even more. 2. Monday mornings had become my least favorite part of the week. The alarm sounded at 6. Breakfast, school lunches, coffee that was never hot by the time I drank it, a quick drive to school, then straight to the bookstore. Every day felt identical. Wake up, work, pay bills. Pretend everything would somehow work itself out. Franklin looked up from behind the register as I arrived. You beat me here. Barely. You look better. I slept almost 6 hours. She laughed. We're celebrating small victories now. I think we have to. She smiled. I like that attitude. I hung my coat in the back room before beginning my morning routine. Straightening displays, dusting shelves, restocking bestsellers. Books had always comforted me. Unlike people, stories usually kept their promises. 2. Just before lunchtime, the familiar chime above the front door rang. I looked up instinctively. Arthur, as always. He carried an umbrella despite the clear blue sky. You came prepared for weather that doesn't exist? He smiled. Experience teaches strange habits. I laughed. I suppose it does. He wandered through the history section before returning with another stack of books. You read faster than anyone I've ever met. I sleep less than I should. That explains it. He placed the books on the counter. I've been thinking about what you said. I say a lot of things. About stories helping people survive impossible moments. I smiled softly. I still believe that. So do I. There was something different about him today. Not sadness. Reflection, as though he had spent the weekend remembering someone. 2. May I ask you something? Of course. Why a bookstore? The question surprised me. I studied literature. I guessed. I wanted to teach. What happened? Life. He nodded. I understand. My husband received a promotion years ago. I stayed home with our daughter. Then life changed again. Arthur didn't ask about Daniel. He never once asked why I wore a wedding ring one week and not the next. He respected silence. That alone made him different from almost everyone else. I've always believed, he said quietly, that books find people exactly when they're needed. I believe that too. M2, a young couple entered the store arguing softly over baby names. Arthur watched them disappear into another aisle. They remind me of someone. Your children. His smile faded. I had a son. Had. Past tense. The word hung between us. I'm sorry. He was 27. My heart tightened. So young. He and his wife were driving home during a snowstorm. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the greatest kindness. Arthur looked toward the bookstore window. There was an accident. I swallowed. I'm so sorry. It happened 30 years ago. That doesn't make it easier. No. He smiled sadly. It doesn't. Vafus, for the next several minutes, neither of us spoke. The bookstore remained peaceful. Soft jazz played quietly through hidden speakers. Customers wandered between shelves. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks. Inside, time seemed to slow. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. My wife survived him. I looked up. For almost 5 years. I'm sorry. I built businesses. He smiled bitterly. Bought buildings. Expanded companies. None of it mattered. He looked around the bookstore. You know what mattered. What? 5 more minutes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I would have traded every dollar I ever earned. I felt tears threaten. Instead, I reached across the counter and gently squeezed his hand. He looked genuinely surprised. Not by the gesture, by how natural it felt. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. I do. He smiled warmly. Most people try fixing grief. I've learned it can't be fixed. No, it can only be carried. For the first time in years, Arthur laughed. A bookseller who understands life. Week Arthur afternoon the bookstore became unusually busy. Arthur quietly helped reshelve books without being asked. You know, customers aren't supposed to work. I'm volunteering. I don't have volunteers. You do today. Mrs. Franklin walked over. You must be Arthur. He smiled. I've heard about me. You've become our most loyal customer. I'll accept that title. She leaned toward me. If he keeps buying books this quickly, we'll have to build another history section. Arthur chuckled. I'd happily finance it. We all laughed. At the time, it sounded like a joke. Later that evening, Daniel called. I wanted to check on Emma. She's finishing homework. I'll talk to her. After several cheerful minutes, Emma handed me the phone. Dade wants to talk to you. I stepped into the hallway. What is it? I wanted to tell you before you heard elsewhere. My stomach tightened. What? Victoria and I are engaged. Silence. Not because I was surprised. Because it happened so quickly. You've known her about 6 months. And you're getting married. Wes? I leaned against the wall. I hope you're happy. I am. I wasn't sure he believed himself. Emma can be a flower girl. The word stunned me. Our daughter? Victoria thought. New. He paused. I didn't even finish. You didn't need to? I thought she'd feel included. She already had a family. Another silence. Longer this time. I didn't call to argue. Nope. You called for permission. He didn't deny it. My answer is still no. He sighed heavily. We'll discuss it later. No. We won't. I ended the call. For nearly a minute, I simply stood there, listening to the quiet house, trying to steady my breathing. The next afternoon Arthur returned. One look at my face, and he knew something had happened. You've had difficult news. I smiled weakly. Is it that obvious? I've spent a lifetime reading people. He waited, never pushing, never demanding. Eventually, I told him, not every detail, just enough. My ex-husband is getting married. So soon. Very. Arthur looked toward the window. Sometimes people confuse excitement with happiness. I suppose. The two aren't the same. I nodded slowly. I know. Arthur reached into his coat pocket. I'd like to ask a favor. I blinked. A favor. I'm sorting through thousands of old family journals. That sounds exhausting. It is. I need someone who appreciates books. I smiled. You've already hired a librarian. I need someone with patience. I work in retail. We survive on patience. He laughed. I suppose that's true. It's only temporary. What exactly would I be doing? Organizing old documents. Whenever your schedule allows. I should probably ask. He smiled knowingly. Yes. Who exactly do you work for? Arthur paused for just a fraction of a second. My family business. And what business is that? Investments. It sounded wonderfully ordinary. I'll think about it. I hoped you would. He handed me a neatly folded envelope. My assistant wrote down the address. I slipped it into my purse without opening it. 2 that night. Curiosity finally won. I unfolded the paper while sitting at the kitchen table. The address seemed familiar. Very familiar. The next morning, on my way to the bookstore, I drove past it, then nearly slammed on the brakes. Stretching before me was one of the tallest buildings downtown, 45 stories of glass and steel. Across the entrance, large silver letters reflected the morning sunlight. CNUECHMOEOLDNGSHZ stared at the sign, then at the business card. Then, back again, Arthur Whitmore. The quiet man who bought second-hand novels, owned one of the largest investment companies in America, and somehow, he had just offered a struggling bookstore employee a job. I sat in my car completely speechless. For the first time since Daniel walked away, the future no longer looked completely impossible. I had no idea that stepping through those glass doors would change not only my career, but the rest of my life forever. I must have read the sign 10 times. RSDMRRCOD Hail DMGS MCs. The letters stretched across the polished granite entrance of one of the most recognizable buildings in the city. People in tailored suits hurried through revolving glass doors. Luxury sedans lined the curb. Uniformed security officers greeted arriving executives by name. This wasn't simply a successful company. It was an empire. And Arthur, the kind old man who spent hours talking about books, owned all of it. I looked down at the folded paper in my hand. The address matched perfectly. My heart began racing. No, I whispered to myself. There has to be another Arthur Whitmore. Deep down, I already knew there wasn't. 2. The entire drive to the bookstore, my mind replayed every conversation we'd shared. Not once had Arthur mentioned being wealthy. Not once had he hinted at owning skyscrapers. He never corrected me when I assumed he was retired. He had simply smiled. Looking back, there had been clues. His tailored suits, the expensive leather shoes, the quiet confidence, the way people instinctively listened whenever he spoke. I'd mistaken humility for ordinary. 2. Mrs. Franklin noticed immediately. You look like you've seen a ghost. Not exactly. I placed the business card on the counter. Do you know who this is? She adjusted her reading glasses. Arthur Whitmore. Les. She looked at me. The Arthur Whitmore. I think so. She laughed. You've been talking to him for weeks. You knew. I assumed you did. I thought he was retired. He practically owns half the financial district. I blinked. And you never mentioned it. She smiled kindly. You never asked. I spent the rest of the morning shelving books without remembering where half of them belonged. Customers kept politely returning misplaced novels. My concentration had completely disappeared. Around noon, the front door chimed. Arthur walked inside carrying his familiar umbrella. He smiled warmly. Good afternoon. I crossed my arms. You own Whitmore Holdings. He looked almost embarrassed. I do. You didn't think that was important. I wasn't applying for friendship. I stared at him. You let me believe you were retired. I let you believe I enjoyed books. Which you do, very much. I couldn't stay annoyed. His smile made that nearly impossible. You really should have told me. I wanted someone to know Arthur. He paused. Not Mr. Whitmore. That answer stayed with me. I almost didn't come today. I suspected. I drove past your building. He chuckled. It is rather difficult to miss. You could have warned me. I was afraid you might stop talking to me. I frowned. Why would I? People often do. I don't understand. Arthur looked toward the bookstore window. Once people discover money, they begin seeing the money before the person. His voice remained calm. They ask different questions. They tell different stories. They expect different things. I thought about that. I never would. I know. How? Because you didn't. For several moments we stood in comfortable silence. Finally he spoke again. The offer still stands. The temporary job. He nodded. No pressure. No obligation. Simply honest work. I hesitated. I've never worked in corporate business. I'm aware. I don't know investment terminology. You won't need to. I don't even own business clothes. Arthur smiled. That problem solves itself. I laughed. I don't want charity. It isn't. What is it? A fair opportunity. That evening I found myself standing outside Whitmore Holdings again. This time, I walked inside. The revolving doors opened into an enormous marble lobby. Sunlight poured through 40-foot windows. Water flowed gently beneath a modern sculpture. Every surface reflected quiet elegance. Not flashy, sophisticated. The receptionist looked up with a welcoming smile. Good afternoon. I have an appointment with... I almost laughed saying it aloud. Arthur Whitmore. Of course. No surprise. No questions. She simply nodded. Upstairs. Whitmore is expecting you. She handed me a visitor badge. 32nd floor. My palms suddenly felt damp. The elevator climbed almost silently. Each floor number seemed to increase my heartbeat. 25, 26, 27. By the time the doors opened, I had almost convinced myself to leave. Instead, I stepped out. The executive floor was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Glass offices overlooked the city skyline. Quiet conversations filled elegant hallways. Original artwork decorated every wall. Employees moved confidently without appearing rushed. The entire floor felt calm, intentional, professional. A woman in a charcoal business suit approached with a friendly smile. Mrs. Carter? Wes. I'm Grace Holloway. She extended her hand. Mr. Whitmore has told me wonderful things about you. I blinked. He has. For months. Months. I suddenly realized Arthur had accidentally become my customer. He had kept coming back intentionally. Grace led me toward Arthur's office. The wooden doors opened quietly. Arthur looked up from behind an enormous desk. There you are. You've been hiding this office. He laughed. I suppose I have. It's enormous. It came with the job. You mean the company? That too. He stood and walked around the desk. No speeches. No apologies. Today. He gestured toward a comfortable seating area overlooking the skyline. We're simply having coffee. A few minutes later, Arthur poured coffee himself. No assistant, no ceremony. Just 2 mugs. You really do make it yourself. I've never trusted anyone else. I smiled. I expected someone in a 3-piece suit. You seem disappointed. I expected less sugar. He laughed loudly. Grace says exactly the same thing. After coffee, Arthur opened several old wooden boxes. Inside, thousands of handwritten journals, photographs, letters, business notebooks dating back decades. My grandfather started writing these in 1928. I carefully picked one up. The handwriting was beautiful. Every generation continued. Arthur nodded. My family history. Why me? Because you'll respect them. You barely know me. I know enough. I looked at him. What do you know? He answered without hesitation. You returned $20 a customer accidentally dropped. You stayed late helping an elderly woman find books. You packed extra lunches for your daughter when another child forgot theirs. You never once complained about your husband inside that bookstore. My eyes widened. You noticed all of that? I noticed people. He walked toward the window overlooking the city. Business teaches numbers. He smiled. Life teaches character. I remained silent. You have something many executives don't. What's that? Perspective. I've spent 30 years interviewing brilliant graduates. They understand finance. They understand markets. They understand strategy. He looked back at me, but very few understand people. I should probably admit something. What? I've never organized historical documents before. Arthur smiled. I know. You still want me? I've wanted you from the beginning. Realizing how that sounded, he laughed. As an employee. I burst into laughter. That sounded terrible. It certainly did. Even Grace, passing the office doorway, couldn't hide her smile. Arthur became serious again. This position is temporary. You'll organize the journals. Digitize important records. Label photographs. Nothing more. And if I'm terrible, I'll know within a week. And I don't think you will be, which I accepted. Not because the salary was generous, although it was. Not because the building was beautiful, although it certainly was. I accepted because, for the first time since Daniel walked away, someone believed in me. Not because I needed saving. Not because they pitied me. Because they genuinely believed I had something valuable to offer. That feeling was worth more than any paycheck. 2 across town, Daniel sat inside Victoria's penthouse, staring at a business magazine. The cover featured a familiar photograph. Arthur Whitmore, America's quiet billionaire. Victoria glanced up. "What are you reading?" "Whitmore Holdings. Excellent company." Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. "I've heard they're expanding." Victoria smiled. "They're one of the most respected firms in the country." She returned to answering emails. Neither of them noticed the irony. The woman Daniel had abandoned would be walking through those executive offices the very next morning. And before long, every decision made inside that building would begin changing all of their lives in ways none of them could possibly imagine. The following Monday, I stood outside Whitmore Holdings 15 minutes early. Not because anyone had asked me to. Because I didn't want to give anyone a reason to regret hiring me. The towering glass building reflected the morning sun, turning the entire skyline into a wall of gold. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. I wasn't nearly as confident. I adjusted the strap of my handbag and took a deep breath. "You can do this." The words sounded much stronger inside my head than they felt in my stomach. The receptionist smiled the moment I entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. You remembered me?" "Mr. Whitmore asked us to expect you." That surprised me. Arthur could have delegated everything. Instead, he'd personally prepared for my arrival. It was a small gesture, but after everything I'd been through, small gestures mattered. The coup grace was already waiting beside the elevators. "Ready for your first day?" "I think so." She smiled. "That's the correct answer. You don't sound convinced." "No one is ever completely ready." The elevator climbed silently toward the executive floor. Unlike my first visit, this time I wasn't staring at the floor numbers. I was staring at my own reflection. Navy blazer, cream blouse, black trousers. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, everything carefully pressed. I had bought the outfit over the weekend using a store discount and every coupon I could find. It wasn't designer, but it made me feel professional. Arthur greeted me outside his office. "You look like you belong here." "I've only been inside twice. Sometimes it's all it takes." He handed me an employee identification badge. Seeing my name beneath the Whitmore Holdings logo felt surreal. Emily Carter, historical records consultant, temporary. Even so, it felt like the beginning of something. Tutu Arthur led me through a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs. Every picture represented another decade of the company's history. Old factories, early employees, groundbreaking ceremonies, family celebrations. "This company has never belonged to one person," Arthur said. "It belongs to everyone who helped build it." I looked closely at one black and white photograph. Dozens of smiling workers stood outside a modest brick warehouse. They looked proud. "They were?" Arthur smiled. "My grandfather knew every employee's name. You do too." "I try." The archive department occupied an entire floor. Climate-controlled rooms stretched in every direction. Shelves reached almost to the ceiling. Thousands of boxes filled with journals, contracts, photographs, and handwritten letters. I stopped walking. "I've never seen anything like this." Arthur laughed. "Neither had I." "When?" "My first day." Grace handed me a digital tablet. "This contains the catalog system. I should warn you. I'm not exactly a technology expert." You don't need to be. She opened the program. The software does most of the work. Within 20 minutes, I understood the basics. Photograph, label, archive, cross-reference, repeat. It wasn't difficult, just detailed. Exactly the kind of work I enjoyed. Arthur watched quietly for a while before leaving. I'll check on you later. I'll still be here. I suspected. He smiled before disappearing down the hallway. 2 hours passed without me noticing. Old photographs fascinated me. Letters from the company's earliest years revealed stories no annual report could ever capture. One journal described employees bringing homemade meals to coworkers during the Great Depression. Another documented a Christmas bonus Arthur's grandfather paid by selling his own car to avoid laying off workers. The company hadn't simply made money, it had built families. I suddenly understood why Arthur protected its history so fiercely. Just before lunch, someone cleared his throat behind me. I turned around. A tall man in a charcoal suit extended his hand. I'm Michael Bennett, the operations director. He smiled. I see you've done homework. I may have searched the company website. Smart. He glanced toward the neatly organized shelves. You've accomplished more in one morning than the last consultant managed in 2 weeks. I laughed. Please don't tell me that. Why not? I'll start expecting impossible things from myself. Michael chuckled. I think you already do. They invited me to lunch in the executive dining room. The invitation alone made me nervous. Around the table sat department heads from every division. Finance, operations, legal, technology. Everyone seemed accomplished, experienced, confident. I suddenly became very aware that I worked in a bookstore only a week earlier. One executive looked at me curiously. So, what made you switch industries? I smiled politely. I still love books. Laughter spread around the table. I'm simply organizing a different lection. Even Arthur smiled. It wasn't a brilliant answer, but it was honest. 2. As lunch continued, the conversation shifted toward leadership. One executive proudly described increasing quarterly profits by reducing staffing costs. Another applauded aggressive restructuring. Arthur listened without interrupting. Finally, he looked toward me. Emily, what would you have done? Every face at the table turned. I nearly dropped my fork. I don't think I'm qualified to answer. I disagree. The room fell silent. I chose my words carefully. I suppose, if profits improve because people lose their jobs again, I'm not sure that's really success. Silence. Complete silence. I immediately wondered if I just embarrassed myself. Then Arthur smiled. So did my grandfather. Several executives quietly nodded. Michael leaned back in his chair. I've been arguing exactly that for 3 years. The tension disappeared. Conversation resumed. Only later did I realize Arthur hadn't asked the question by accident. He had wanted everyone in the room to hear my answer. Late that afternoon, Grace stopped by carrying several thick binders. Arthur wants these digitized next. I accepted them. Any deadline? She smiled. He said you'd ask that? And? He said you'll finish when you finish. I laughed. That doesn't sound very corporate. No. Grace smiled warmly. It sounds like Arthur. The 2 across the city. Daniel's new life looked perfect from the outside. Luxury apartment. Private driver. Designer clothes. Expensive dinners. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks. Victoria walked into the penthouse carrying several shopping bags. I bought artwork. Daniel looked up from the television. We already have artwork. Not for the guest wing. I didn't know we had a guest wing. She smiled. We do now. Construction crews had spent the entire week remodeling rooms Daniel hadn't even known existed. Everything changed without anyone asking his opinion. Every decision belonged to Victoria. At first, he had mistaken being provided for as being valued. The difference was becoming painfully obvious. Saturday. Victoria glanced at her calendar. My parents are hosting a dinner. Okay, they'd like to meet you. Daniel smiled nervously. Sounds good? She looked up. One thing? What? My father dislikes discussing previous marriages. Daniel frowned. So don't mention Emily. The room became strangely quiet. And Emma? Victoria hesitated. If possible, keep the conversation focused elsewhere. Daniel stared at her. Our daughter is 8. I know. She's part of my life. Victoria walked closer. I'm simply trying to make a good first impression. Daniel didn't answer. For the first time, something inside him felt wrong. Not because Victoria was cruel, because she saw his past as an inconvenience. Back at Whitmore Holdings, the workday finally ended. Most employees rushed toward the elevators. I remained behind organizing one final box. Arthur returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. I had a feeling you'd still be here. I wanted to finish this section. You'll discover something. What? The archives never end. I laughed. So perfection is impossible. Exactly. He handed me the coffee. Learn to leave something for tomorrow. I looked at the shelves surrounding us. Thousands of stories. Thousands of lives. Thousands of moments preserved forever. Thank you. For what? For believing I could do this. Arthur became unusually serious. No, Emily. I didn't believe you could. He smiled. I knew you could. For the second time in my life, someone had looked at me and seen more than I saw in myself. The first had been my father. The second was standing beside me holding 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us realized it then. But the trust forming between us wasn't simply employer and employee. It was becoming something much deeper. Arthur wasn't just rebuilding an archive. He was quietly rebuilding the confidence a broken marriage had almost taken away. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of Whitmore Holdings, life was already arranging the next unexpected turn in a story none of us yet understood. By the end of my second week at Whitmore Holdings, I had developed a routine. I arrived 30 minutes early, not because anyone expected me to. Because I enjoyed the quiet. Before the elevators filled with executives discussing meetings and quarterly reports, before phones began ringing go, before the building came alive, there was a peaceful stillness. The archive floor belonged entirely to me. Rows of carefully preserved boxes stretched into the distance like the shelves of an enormous library. Only instead of novels, these shelves contained people's lives. Every letter, every photograph, every handwritten note. Someone, decades earlier, had decided those moments deserved to be remembered. I intended to honor that decision. Phew, you're here before me again. I turned to find Arthur standing in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought CEOs were supposed to arrive later. He smiled. I've never liked stereotypes. He handed me one of the cups. You've made remarkable progress. I glanced around the room. I've barely finished one section. Arthur looked thoughtfully at the organized shelves. You've done something more important. What's that? You've brought order back. He walked slowly between the shelves, occasionally stopping to look at an old photograph. I haven't visited this room in years. Why? He gently picked up a framed photograph of several smiling employees from the 1970s. Too many memories. His voice was softer than usual. I kept telling myself I'd come back someday. And I never did. Until now. He placed the photograph back exactly where he'd found it. My wife loved this room. I didn't know that. She cataloged many of these journals herself. I smiled. She must have loved history. She loved preserving people. Arthur laughed quietly. She used to say memories disappear much faster than buildings. He looked around the archive. I think she was right. Ew. For the next hour, we worked together in comfortable silence. Arthur occasionally recognized names in old ledgers. He shared stories about former employees, people who had started sweeping warehouse floors before eventually becoming department managers. Families who had worked for Whitmore Holdings across 3 generations. Listening to him, I realized something. He never talked about profits, or market share, or acquisitions. He talked about people, always people. Around mid-morning, Michael entered carrying several folders. I hate interrupting. You aren't. Michael placed the folders on my desk. These are from the original company headquarters. Arthur smiled. I wondered when you'd finally find those. Michael nodded toward me. I also wanted to say something. I looked up. About what? The board meeting yesterday. Oh, you impressed several people. I laughed awkwardly. I barely said anything. Exactly. He smiled. You spoke only when you had something worth saying. Michael hesitated before continuing. I've been here 22 years. That's impressive. I've watched hundreds of executives come and go. He folded his arms. Most try to sound intelligent. You didn't. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. It absolutely is. Arthur quietly smiled from across the room. After Michael left, I looked at Arthur. Was yesterday some sort of test? He didn't answer immediately. Do you know why I invited you to lunch? I assumed you were being kind. I was. But there was another reason. I wanted my executives to meet someone who measured success differently. I blinked. They're brilliant people. They are. But brilliance without compassion eventually becomes dangerous. These were his words stayed with me for the rest of the morning. Compassion. It wasn't something people usually discussed in boardrooms. Maybe they should. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived carrying a sealed envelope. This was delivered for you. I frowned. For me. The no return address. I carefully opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. It was from the bank. I expected another warning. Instead, I stared at the page in confusion. The overdue mortgage payment had been received. My account was current. I read the letter again. Then again. There had to be a mistake. I hurried downstairs and called the bank. First National Mortgage. This is Emily Carter. I just received a statement saying my account is current. That's correct. I think there's been an error. The representative typed for several moments. No error, Mrs. Carter. The outstanding balance was paid this morning. By whom? I'm sorry. We're unable to disclose that information. The call ended. I remained frozen. Someone had made my mortgage payment. But who? My first thought was Daniel. I immediately dismissed it. If Daniel had done something generous, he would have made sure everyone knew. Mrs. Franklin couldn't afford it. Neither could anyone else I knew. That left only one possibility. Arthur. I marched directly toward his office. He looked up from a report. You seem determined. Mine a mortgage. He remained perfectly calm. What about it? Someone paid it. I see. Was it you? Arthur removed his reading glasses. No. You didn't. I did not pay your mortgage. I studied his face. He wasn't lying. I don't understand. Neither did I. That evening, I visited the bank in person. After nearly each manager finally agreed to tell me one thing. The payment came from an anonymous charitable trust. A trust. Wes. No individual name. Can I contact them? I'm afraid not. I walked back to my car more confused than ever. Someone had quietly rescued my home. Without asking for recognition. Across town. Daniel sat inside Victoria's luxury dining room surrounded by her parents. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath an enormous chandelier. Everything looked perfect. Until conversation turned toward family. Victoria's father smiled politely. So, Daniel, I understand you've been married before. Daniel glanced toward Victoria. She subtly looked away. Yes. And children. He hesitated. I have a daughter. The room became noticeably quieter. Victoria's mother forced a smile. How wonderful. Daniel immediately recognized the discomfort. Nobody asked another question about Emma. Instead, the conversation returned to business. Investments. Vacation homes, luxury travel. By dessert, Daniel realized something. They weren't interested in knowing him. They were evaluating him. Like another business acquisition. Later that night, Daniel stood alone on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city. Victoria joined him. You handled dinner well. I'm not sure. My father likes you. I don't think he knows me. He knows enough. Daniel looked toward the lights below. My daughter didn't come up once after dinner. Victoria remained silent. I don't like that. We're building a new future. I know. But my past didn't disappear. For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely annoyed. Daniel, you can't keep living in two worlds. The words lingered long after she returned inside. Two worlds. Maybe she was right. The problem, was that he'd begun missing the one he'd abandoned. The following morning, Arthur found me standing in front of an old black and white photograph. It showed dozens of employees gathered outside the company's original warehouse. What are you looking at? The faces. What about them? They're smiling. Arthur nodded. They believe they mattered. I think that's why. He smiled proudly. My grandfather always said, a company doesn't become great because of its buildings. It becomes great because people wake up every morning believing their work means something. I looked around the archive. Did you believe that too? I've spent my entire life trying to. Weeks before walking away, Arthur paused. Emily? Yes. I have another favor. I laughed. You're collecting quite a few. I know. This one is slightly unusual. I'm listening. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? I blinked. Dinner. He immediately raised both hands. Not socially. I couldn't help laughing. You really should explain these things faster. Arthur laughed as well. I'd like you to meet someone. Who? My oldest friend. He runs one of our charitable foundations. Arthur's smile became thoughtful. I think the two of you would have a great deal to talk about. I agreed. Never imagining that the dinner Arthur was arranging had very little to do with charity, and everything to do with a decision he had quietly been considering for weeks. A decision that would eventually change not only my future, but the future of Whitmore Holdings itself. The invitation stayed on my kitchen table for 2 days. Not because I didn't want to go, because I kept wondering why Arthur had chosen me. He could have invited executives, board members, politicians. Instead, he wanted a bookstore employee turned temporary archivist to have dinner with one of his oldest friends. It didn't make sense. Not yet. Emma looked up from her homework. Mom. Yes. Why are you staring at that envelope? I have dinner tonight. She smiled mischievously. Date, I laughed. No. You smiled. I always smile. You smiled differently. Children noticed everything. No dates. Promise. I promise. She nodded with complete satisfaction before returning to her math worksheet. I'll be at Grandma's after school. Just for a few hours. Okay. She never complained. She trusted me. That trust reminded me every single day why I couldn't afford to fall apart. At exactly 6 o'clock, I arrived at the restaurant Arthur had chosen. It overlooked the river just outside downtown. Elegant. Quiet. Nothing extravagant. The hostess smiled warmly. Mrs. Carter. Yes. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. She led me toward a private dining room surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows. Arthur stood as I entered. You came. You sounded disappointed. I was relieved. He smiled. I worried you'd cancel. I almost did. I know. Only one other man sat at the table. He appeared to be in his early 70s. Gray hair. Friendly eyes. An easy smile. Arthur introduced us. Emily, this is Thomas Reynolds. Thomas stood and shook my hand. It's nice to finally meet you. I frowned slightly. Finally. Arthur and Thomas exchanged a glance. Thomas laughed. I've heard a great deal about you. I looked toward Arthur. You've been talking about me? Arthur calmly took his seat. Quite a lot. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Dinner began simply. Soup, fresh bread, quiet conversation. Thomas asked about books. Emma. My favorite authors. Nothing felt unusual, until he asked one unexpected question. If someone gave you $10 million tomorrow, what would you do first? I almost laughed. Pay my mortgage. The two older men smiled. After that, I thought for a moment. Probably sleep. They laughed. I'm serious. I haven't slept well in months. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. And after you've rested, I'd make sure Emma never worried about money. Arthur remained completely silent. Listening, observing, the way he always did. Thomas leaned forward. What about yourself? What about me? What would you buy? I shrugged. Nothing. He raised an eyebrow. Nothing. I already know expensive things don't make people stay. The room became very quiet. Arthur looked down at his coffee. Thomas slowly nodded. I suspected you'd answer that way. The conversation shifted toward Whitmore Holdings. Thomas smiled. Arthur tells me you're reorganizing the archives. I'm trying. He also says you've become rather popular. I laughed. I don't think so. Arthur looked amused. Michael Bennett disagrees. Michael's just being polite. Nope. Arthur shook his head. He isn't. He requested you attend next week's department meeting. I blinked. Why? He says you notice details everyone else misses. I organize old papers. You organize information. Arthur smiled. There's a difference. After dinner, Thomas excused himself for a phone call. Arthur and I stepped onto the outdoor terrace overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered across the water. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. You're wondering why I invited you. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. I wanted another opinion. About what? He looked across the river. Legacy. I've spent 50 years building Whitmore Holdings. It shows. I've built offices, companies, foundations, scholarships. He sighed quietly. But lately, I've started wondering whether I built enough. I frowned. You've helped thousands of people. Perhaps. But businesses eventually belong to someone else. He looked at me. What remains after that? I answered honestly. The people you changed. Arthur smiled. My wife used to say exactly that. When Thomas returned, the conversation became lighter. Stories about travel, old books, favorite restaurants. By the end of the evening, I found myself laughing harder than I had in months. Walking back toward the parking lot, Arthur stopped beside his car. Thank you. For dinner. For reminding an old man what matters. I don't think I did anything. He smiled knowingly. You rarely realize when you do. The following morning, Michael knocked gently on the archive office door. Busy. Always. He stepped inside carrying a folder. The executive committee wants to meet you. My stomach tightened. Why? Relax. No one's in trouble. They'd like your opinion. On what? He handed me the folder. Inside were photographs of several abandoned company properties. We're deciding whether to sell them. I looked through the images. Old factories, warehouses, small office buildings. One picture immediately caught my attention. What is this? Michael glanced down. Our original warehouse. It's empty. It has been for years. I looked at the faded brick building. Why sell it? It isn't profitable. I closed the folder. Not everything valuable earns money. Michael smiled. I had a feeling you'd say that. Later that afternoon, Emily stood before 8 senior executives. Every face around the polished conference table had decades more business experience than she did. Arthur sat quietly near the end of the table, watching, listening, not interfering. One executive spoke confidently. The warehouse costs more to maintain than it's worth. Another nodded. The land alone would sell for millions. Arthur finally looked toward me. Emily? Every eye turned. I took a slow breath. I understand the numbers. The room remained silent. But I gently placed the old photograph on the table. This building is where thousands of families earned their first paycheck. I looked around the room. Children went to college because of this place. Couples bought their first homes. Entire careers began there. I paused. If we sell it, we make money. If we preserve it, keep our history. Silence. Complete silence. Then Michael spoke. I agree. Another executive slowly nodded. So do I. Within minutes, the unanimous decision changed. The warehouse would remain, not because it was profitable, because it mattered. Tuesday, the meeting. Arthur caught up with me in the hallway. You've just saved a piece of this company's history. I only gave an opinion. No. He smiled proudly. You reminded everyone why Whitmore Holdings exists. The two across town. Daniel's phone buzzed while sitting in Victoria's penthouse. An old coworker had sent him a business article. I see you HITMREIINGSONOUNCCs HESTORICPSRVTIO PARPRO JCTs. Attached beneath the headline was a photograph, Emily, standing beside Arthur Whitmore. Daniel stared at the screen. His heart skipped. Why? Was Emily standing next to one of the most respected businessmen in America? He enlarged the picture. Arthur wasn't simply posing beside her. He was looking at her with unmistakable pride. For the first time since leaving his marriage, Daniel felt something he hadn't expected. Not jealousy, not anger, fear, real fear. Because somewhere deep inside, he realized Emily's life hadn't fallen apart after he left. It had quietly begun moving in a direction neither of them had ever imagined. And for the very first time, Daniel wondered if walking away from his family had been the single greatest mistake of his entire life. The article wasn't supposed to attract much attention. Whitmore Holdings had issued hundreds of press releases over the years. Most were read by investors. A few by business journalists. Then they disappeared. This one was different. A simple photograph accompanied the announcement. Arthur Whitmore standing beside one of his newest employees. Me. I hadn't even realized the company photographer had taken the picture. The headline wasn't about me. It was about preserving the company's original headquarters. Still, my face appeared in every business publication the following morning. Mom. Emma ran into the kitchen carrying my phone. You're famous! I looked up from making breakfast. What? She held the screen toward me. There you are. Sure enough. The article had already been shared online dozens of times. There I was, standing beside Arthur, both of us smiling while looking at the century-old warehouse. I laughed. I'm hardly famous. You look important. I was just standing there. She frowned. Maybe important people stand there. Children had a wonderful way of simplifying life. By the time I arrived at Whitmore Holdings, something had changed. People I'd never met smiled as I walked through the lobby. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Morning, Emily. Congratulations on the preservation project. I wasn't used to strangers knowing my name. The attention felt uncomfortable. Grace noticed immediately. You've become recognizable. I'd rather not. She laughed. You'll get used to it. I hope not. Arthur's office door stood open. He looked up as I knocked. I see you've discovered the article. I wasn't expecting this. Neither was our public relations department. I sat across from him. People keep congratulating me. They should. I didn't do very much. Arthur smiled. You continue underestimating yourself. I simply suggested saving a building. Nut. He leaned back in his chair. You reminded an entire board of directors why this company exists. The two a knock interrupted the conversation. Michael stepped inside carrying several folders. The quarterly employee satisfaction report. Arthur gestured toward the conference table. Let's review it. Michael opened the first folder. Our financial performance remains strong. Arthur nodded. And morale? Michael hesitated. Mixed. What happened? Several department managers have been focusing heavily on productivity. Arthur looked thoughtful. And people. Some employees feel overlooked. Arthur remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he looked toward me. What would you do? I nearly laughed. I think you're asking the wrong person. I disagree. Michael smiled. So do I. I carefully thought before answering. I'd start by asking employees. Arthur nodded. Asking them what? What they need. Michael leaned forward. We already conduct surveys. I don't mean surveys. I looked at both men. I mean conversations. The room became quiet. When was the last time a department manager sat down with someone simply to ask, "How are you doing?" No performance review. No agenda. Just genuine interest. Arthur slowly smiled. My grandfather called those hallway meetings. He spent more time listening than talking. Michael scribbled something into his notebook. I think we stopped doing that years ago. Arthur nodded. Perhaps it's time we started again. The news of the discussion spread surprisingly fast. By lunchtime, several managers had already scheduled informal meetings with their teams. One executive jokingly called them Emily Conversations. I rolled my eyes. I hope that name disappears. Michael laughed. It won't. The archives continued keeping me busy. Late that afternoon, I opened a box that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, hundreds of handwritten letters. Most came from former employees. One caught my attention immediately. The envelope simply read, "S to whoever leads Whitmore Holdings next." I blinked. The letter was over 40 years old. Carefully unfolding the yellowed paper, I began reading. Leadership isn't measured by buildings, or profits, or newspaper headlines. The true measure of leadership is whether ordinary people sleep better at night because you came to work that morning. No signature, only initials. A.W. Arthur Whitmore. He had written it decades earlier, long before I ever met him. I quietly carried the letter upstairs. Arthur looked up as I entered. You found something. I handed him the paper. He adjusted his reading glasses, then smiled. I forgot I wrote this. You wrote it. I was 33. He laughed softly. I believed I understood leadership. And now, I've learned I understood very little. I looked at the final sentence. You still believe this? More than ever. He carefully folded the letter. My wife convinced me to write those. Really? I used to become frustrated after difficult meetings. She suggested writing instead of arguing. I smiled. Wise woman. The wisest. The two across town. Daniel's life continued changing. Victoria had become increasingly focused on expanding her family's investment portfolio. Every dinner conversation centered around acquisitions, market forecasts, private equity, luxury developments. Daniel found himself speaking less each week. One evening, Victoria looked up from her laptop. Arthur Whitmore. What about him? I've been trying to arrange a meeting for months. Daniel remained quiet. Our firms may partner next year. She looked directly at him. You've never met him. Daniel hesitated. Not exactly. He had never met Arthur, but Arthur certainly knew who he was. Daniel had no idea. That weekend, Emma asked a question I'd been quietly dreading. Mom? Yes. Does Dad still love us? I stopped folding laundry. Children never ask easy questions. He loves you very much. What about you? The room became painfully quiet. I sat beside her. Sometimes, grown-ups make choices they later wish they hadn't. She looked down. Did I do something wrong? My heart shattered. No. I gently lifted her chin. Never think that. This wasn't because of you. Promise. I promise. She wrapped her arms around me. I like when you're happy. I hugged her tightly. I like it too. E2 Monday morning. Arthur arrived unusually early. Instead of heading toward his office, he came directly to the archives. I've been thinking. That usually means trouble. He laughed. Probably. He walked slowly between the shelves. You've changed this department. I organized it. You changed more than the shelves. He looked around thoughtfully. People come here now. I frowned. They never used to. Almost never. He smiled. No executives stop by simply to talk. I hadn't noticed he was right. Grace visited almost daily. Michael frequently appeared. Several department managers had begun browsing the historical photographs during lunch. The archives were becoming the heart of the building. Arthur stopped beside one of the oldest display cases. My grandfather believed every company needed a soul. And I think ours wandered away for a while. He looked directly at me. You're helping us find it again. I felt my face grow warm. I'm just doing my job. No. Arthur smiled. You're reminding us who we wanted to become. Later that afternoon, Grace entered carrying several legal folders. Arthur, they're ready. He nodded. Good. I looked between them. What are you two planning? Arthur smiled mysteriously. A great deal. Grace couldn't hide her smile either. You're going to be surprised. Neither of them offered another explanation. But as Grace carried the folders into Arthur's office, I caught a glimpse of the title on the top document. City State Planning Revision. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? Every successful businessman updates legal paperwork from time to time. I had no way of knowing that inside those folders, Arthur was beginning to rewrite the future, not only for Whitmore Holdings, but for me, and for everyone whose lives would soon become connected by one extraordinary decision. The first hint that something had changed came from Arthur. For nearly 2 months, he had visited the archives almost every morning. Sometimes we discussed books, sometimes company history, sometimes nothing at all. He simply enjoyed sitting in the old leather chair by the window while I worked. But that Monday, he didn't come. 9 o'clock passed. Then 10. By lunchtime, I realized I hadn't seen him all day. It felt strange, not alarming, just unusual. Michael noticed me looking toward the hallway, expecting someone. I haven't seen Arthur. He has back-to-back meetings. Since when? Michael smiled. Since the board discovered he's suddenly interested in restoring old buildings, employee programs, and company history. I laughed. So they're blaming me. They're giving you credit. I don't want credit. Michael shook his head. That's exactly why Arthur trusts you. The executive floor felt different, more relaxed. Managers actually stopped to speak with employees instead of hurrying past them. Several departments had adopted weekly coffee meetings where anyone could suggest improvements. One manager had even removed the executive-only dining area. Instead, everyone ate together. The atmosphere inside Whitmore Holdings had slowly begun changing. Not because of a company policy, because Arthur had started leading differently, and people noticed. That afternoon, Arthur finally appeared. He looked tired, not exhausted, just older. You disappeared. He smiled weakly. So I've been told. You should take a day off. I own the company. Exactly. I can't fire myself. I laughed. You could certainly ignore your calendar. Arthur slowly sat in his favorite chair. I had medical appointments. I immediately became concerned. Everything okay? He hesitated. For the moment, the answer wasn't reassuring. Kurt, you don't have to tell me. I know. He looked around the archive. Strange. What is? I spent decades believing my company couldn't survive a single day without me. And it survived this morning quite well. I smiled. Maybe that's a good sign. It is. He looked thoughtful. Every leader eventually reaches a moment where they must decide whether they built a business or dependency. Vigo's words stayed with me long after he left. Something in his voice had changed. It wasn't fear. It sounded more like preparation. Tutu across the city, Daniel was discovering that luxury came with invisible rules. Victoria's assistant handed him an itinerary. What's this? Your schedule. He frowned. My schedule. Mrs. Sinclair asked me to coordinate your week. Daniel slowly read the page. Monday, golf with investors. Tuesday, dinner with clients. Wednesday, charity gala. Thursday, media interview. Friday, private fundraising event. Every hour, already assigned. He looked toward Victoria. I don't remember agreeing to this. She barely looked up from her laptop. You'll enjoy it. I might have wanted an opinion. She finally met his eyes. This lifestyle requires planning. It also requires freedom. Victoria smiled politely. Freedom is overrated. Daniel didn't answer, but something inside him quietly did. Too later that evening, Daniel stopped by the house to see Emma. She ran outside before he even parked. Daddy. He lifted her into the air. I missed you. I made you a picture. She proudly handed him a folded drawing. 3 people stood holding hands. One small figure stood slightly apart. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Who's this? Emma pointed. That's me. And these? You? That she hesitated. And Mommy. He looked carefully. The 3 figures weren't standing together. There was space between them. Children often drew exactly what they felt. Without realizing it, Emma had illustrated the distance he had created. Emily watched quietly from the porch. Daniel walked over after Emma returned inside. Can we talk? For a minute. He held up the drawing. She's struggling. I know. I've been trying. So have I. Daniel looked toward the house. Victoria doesn't understand. Emily remained silent. She thinks Emma just needs time. What do you think? I think. He looked down at the paper. I broke something. Emily studied his face. For the first time, he looked genuinely regretful. Not because life had become difficult, because he finally understood the cost. 2. I can't fix this overnight. No. Emily answered gently. You can't, but you can keep showing up. Daniel nodded slowly. I want to. Then do that. No promises, no speeches. Just be her father. 2. Daniel smiled sadly. You've always made everything sound simple. It isn't simple. Emily shook her head. It's just clear. Back at Whitmore Holdings, Grace entered Arthur's office carrying several legal folders. I've finished the revisions. Arthur removed his glasses. So soon. You've changed your instructions 4 times. He smiled. I wanted to be certain. Grace carefully placed the documents on the desk. The board will be surprised. I imagine they will. And your relatives. Arthur looked toward the city skyline. They'll be furious. Grace hesitated. Are you absolutely sure? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the large window. Thousands of employees worked in buildings stretching across the city. Factories, warehouses, corporate offices, research centers. He had spent his life building them. Now, he was deciding who deserved to protect them. Finally, he spoke. I've spent 74 years learning one lesson. Grace waited quietly. Character is much harder to find than intelligence. She nodded. I agree. I've already found intelligence. Arthur smiled faintly. What I've been searching for is character. The following morning, Michael arrived at the archives carrying a thick folder. I need your help. Mine. The board wants ideas for our annual employee appreciation event. I laughed. I've organized book clubs, not company celebrations. He smiled. Exactly. You think differently. Emily opened the folder. The previous events all looked the same. They were. Expensive hotel. Formal dinner. Executive speeches. She flipped through several years of photographs. Did employees enjoy them? Michael shrugged. They attended. That's not the same thing. He laughed. Arthur said you'd say something like that. Emily thought quietly. What if we held it at the original warehouse? Michael blinked. The one we're restoring. She nodded. The place where everything started. Invite retired employees. Current employees. Their families. Display the company's history. Celebrate the people who built it. Michael slowly smiled. You've just made my job much easier. By the end of the week, the entire executive committee approved the idea unanimously. News spread quickly. Former employees began writing letters thanking the company. Some hadn't visited headquarters in over 20 years. Arthur read every single letter personally, one afternoon. He quietly placed the stack on Emily's desk. Read these. She opened the first envelope. Thank you for remembering us. The second. I never thought the company still cared. The third. My husband worked there for 42 years. He would have been proud, Doss. Emily looked up. They're beautiful. Arthur smiled softly. No. They're proof. Proof of what? That kindness always earns interest. That evening, Arthur remained alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He opened a locked drawer. Inside lay the newest version of his will. He read the final page once more, then signed his initials beside the last revision. His hand lingered on the paper, not with uncertainty, with peace. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Arthur quietly closed the folder. His decision had been made. He simply hoped, when the time finally came, the people he loved would understand why. By October, Whitmore Holdings felt like a different company. Not because profits had changed. Those had always been strong. It was the atmosphere. People smiled more. Managers lingered in hallways instead of rushing from meeting to meeting. Executives actually knew the names of receptionists, custodians, and interns. The old walls hadn't changed. The people inside them had. One morning, while organizing another collection of Arthur's journals, I found a handwritten note tucked inside a leather-bound notebook. There were only 6 words. Czar never let success replace kindness, Tosser. There wasn't a signature. There didn't need to be. I already knew who had written it. I quietly slipped the note back where I found it. Some lessons deserved to remain exactly where history had placed them. 9:30, Arthur appeared in the archive room, carrying his usual coffee. He looked healthier than he had the previous week. Still tired, but peaceful. You found another one. I held up the notebook. You hide wisdom in strange places. He smiled. My wife used to say people pay more attention when they discover things themselves. I think she was right. I stopped arguing with her after about 30 years. I laughed. Only 30. I was stubborn? We're. Arthur grinned. Old habits die slowly. We worked quietly together for nearly an hour. Eventually, Arthur sat down in the leather chair by the window. Emily? Can I ask you something personal, of course? If you could erase everything Daniel did, would you? The question surprised me. I stopped typing. For a long moment, I honestly didn't know. Finally, I answered, no. Arthur looked genuinely curious. No, I wouldn't erase it. Why? Because I slowly looked around the archive. If he hadn't left, I never would have met you. Silence settled between us. Arthur smiled. Life has a peculiar sense of humor. It does. I wouldn't wish the pain on anyone. I continued. But I've become someone stronger because I survived it. Arthur nodded slowly. The strongest people rarely choose hardship. They simply refuse to let hardship define them. That afternoon, the annual employee celebration took place inside the restored original warehouse. Hundreds of employees arrived with their families. Retired workers reunited after decades apart. Old photographs lined the brick walls. Historic machinery had been carefully restored. Children ran between displays while grandparents pointed toward pictures of themselves from 40 years earlier. The building no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Arthur stood quietly near the entrance watching people laugh. Michael walked over. I've never seen attendance this high. Arthur smiled. They didn't come for speeches. They came because they belong here. But Emily spent the afternoon speaking with retired employees. One elderly woman introduced herself as Helen. My husband worked here for 38 years. She gently touched one of the framed photographs. He loved this company. Emily smiled. Arthur loved him too. Helen blinked. You know, blinked Whitmore well. I've been lucky enough to. Helen reached into her purse and removed a faded photograph. My husband kept this in his wallet. It showed Arthur as a young man standing beside warehouse employees during a snowstorm. Everyone was smiling. No suits. No executives. Just people. He helped shovel snow so everyone could go home for Christmas. Helen smiled through tears. He never told anyone. Emily looked at the picture for a long time. Some people earned respect without asking for it. Arthur was one of them. 2 hours later that afternoon, Arthur stepped onto the small stage. There was no prepared speech, no teleprompter, no corporate slogans. He simply adjusted the microphone. When my grandfather opened this warehouse, the company employed 12 people. He smiled. Today, we employ thousands. Polite applause echoed through the building. Arthur raised his hand. But I hope you understand something. The buildings aren't the company. You are. The room became silent. My grandfather believed every employee should leave work feeling respected. I've spent my life trying to honor that. He paused. I haven't always succeeded. Several people quietly shook their heads. Arthur smiled. No, Pooh. Let me finish. I've made mistakes. I've spent too much time chasing growth. Too many late nights. Too many missed birthdays. I've learned. The balance sheet tells only part of the story. He looked across the warehouse. The real success of Whitmore Holdings. Is every family represented in this room? For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the applause began. Slowly. One pair of hands, then another. Soon the entire warehouse stood. The standing ovation continued for nearly 2 minutes. Arthur looked genuinely overwhelmed. He hadn't expected it. After the celebration ended, Arthur remained behind helping employees carry folding chairs. One retired worker laughed. Mr. Whitmore, you don't have to do that. Arthur smiled. I've been moving chairs since I was 16. No reason to stop now. Emily watched quietly from across the room. It wasn't an act. No cameras remained. No reporters. This was simply who Arthur was. As the sun began setting, Arthur walked outside with Emily. The old warehouse glowed beneath strings of warm lights. Families were still taking photographs together. Children laughed in the distance. Arthur leaned lightly against the brick wall. I've been thinking about retirement. Emily smiled. I thought you retired years ago. He laughed. So did everyone else. Then his smile slowly faded. I'm serious. She turned toward him. You've built something incredible. I know. But every builder eventually hands someone else the tools. Emily nodded. That's how legacies continue. Arthur looked thoughtfully at the old warehouse. Exactly. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel's perfect new life was beginning to unravel. He entered the penthouse expecting another quiet evening. Instead, he found Victoria arguing with 2 investment advisors. I told you to sell last week. Victoria snapped. The market corrected unexpectedly. One advisor carefully replied, we're still in an excellent position. No. Victoria slammed a folder shut. We're down $12 million. Daniel froze. 12 million. The number barely seemed real. After the advisors left, he cautiously asked, is everything okay? Victoria poured herself a glass of sparkling water. We'll recover. You seem worried. I'm irritated. She walked toward the window. My father hates losing. Daniel hesitated. I thought your investments were safe. They are. She glanced back. But nobody stays rich by accepting losses. For the first time, Daniel realized something important. Victoria didn't measure life by happiness. She measured it by numbers. Every conversation, every decision, every relationship, everything became a calculation. That weekend, Daniel visited Emma again. She happily showed him a school essay. The title reading, "The Person I Want to Be." Daniel smiled. "Can I read it?" She nodded proudly. The first sentence made his heart ache.
Afe.
"I want to be kind like my mom because people always feel better after talking to her." If there wasn't a single mention of money, success, cars, or expensive houses. Only kindness. Daniel quietly folded the paper. When did she write this? Emily smiled gently. Last week. He looked toward the house, then back at the essay somewhere. Without realizing it, he had spent months chasing wealth, while the little girl he loved admired something money could never buy. To the following Monday morning, Grace arrived at Arthur's office carrying another thick folder. "The revisions are complete." Arthur nodded. "No more changes." "You're certain?" He looked toward the city skyline, more certain than he'd ever been. "I've spent my life preparing this company for the future." He smiled quietly. "No, it's time to prepare the future for the company." Grace carefully placed the folder inside the office safe. Neither of them noticed Emily walking past the open doorway carrying another box of historical journals. She smiled and waved, completely unaware that behind the heavy steel door sat a document that would soon change her life forever. 2. What would you do if someone trusted you with a legacy bigger than yourself? Let me know in the comments. If you're enjoying Emily's journey, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because the biggest twist is still ahead. The morning began like every other. Coffee, emails, boxes of old journals waiting to be cataloged. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But sometimes, the biggest moments in life arrive disguised as ordinary days. I had no idea this would be the last normal morning Arthur Whitmore would ever have. Poor Arthur arrived just after 8 carrying his usual cup of black coffee. He looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him. His smile was still there, but it seemed heavier somehow. "You beat me here again. I've started treating this place like my second home." He chuckled. "I was hoping you would." I frowned. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." He slowly removed his overcoat. "I've spent enough time around people to know who feels responsible." "You do. So, do you." For several minutes we worked quietly together. Arthur carefully examined several old photographs while I updated the archive database. Eventually he stopped beside one particular picture. A much younger Arthur stood outside the original warehouse with his wife beside him. She was laughing at something just beyond the camera. I'd never seen him smile like that. She was beautiful. Arthur nodded. She made every room brighter. You still miss her. Every day. He gently touched the edge of the photograph. People think grief fades. He smiled sadly. It doesn't. It simply learns better manners. I looked toward him. Can I ask something? Anything. What was her name? Arthur smiled immediately. Evelyn. The way he said it made it sound as though she had just stepped into another room. Tell me about her. He laughed quietly. She hated expensive restaurants. Really. Preferred diners. Collected antique teacups. Read mystery novels faster than I could buy them. I smiled. You loved her very much. I still do. Her author carefully returned the photograph to its box. People spend too much time asking whether love survives death. He looked toward the window. I've never questioned it. Why not? Because I speak to her every morning. His answer wasn't strange. It wasn't dramatic. It simply sounded honest. Around 10 o'clock, Grace entered carrying several legal folders. Arthur, the trustees have arrived. He nodded. I'll be right there. Grace looked toward me. We'll probably need the conference room for a while. No problem. Arthur smiled before leaving. I'll see you later. Those 4 words echoed in my mind for reasons I couldn't explain. The conference room remained occupied for nearly 3 hours. Through the glass walls, I occasionally saw attorneys entering and leaving. Grace, Michael, two elderly men I'd never met. Stacks of legal documents covered the polished conference table. Arthur spoke very little. He listened. Inside the meeting, one attorney carefully adjusted his glasses. Mr. Whitmore. We're reviewing the final version. Arthur nodded. Please continue. The majority ownership of Whitmore Holdings transfers exactly as instructed. Yes. The charitable foundations remain fully funded. Correct? The scholarship programs continue prominently. Arthur nodded again. And the personal estate. The attorney hesitated. Your family is unlikely to challenge the charitable gifts. Arthur looked directly at him. They'll challenge everything else. I'm afraid so. Grace quietly added. They'll argue undue influence. Arthur smiled faintly. They're welcome to. The attorney continued. We've documented your reasoning in detail. Arthur reached for a handwritten letter resting beside the documents. I'd like this included. Grace recognized the letter immediately. You finished it. I did. She carefully accepted the envelope. Across the front, Arthur had written only 3 words. To Emily Carter. Said when the meeting ended, Arthur looked noticeably exhausted. Grace walked beside him toward his office. Maybe we should postpone tomorrow's meetings. No. You've barely rested. I've rested enough. Grace stopped walking. No, you haven't. Arthur smiled kindly. You've worried about me for 20 years. I'm going to miss that. She frowned. Miss. Arthur immediately changed the subject. How's your grandson? Grace knew exactly what he'd done, but she answered anyway. Starting kindergarten. Arthur smiled warmly. Tell him never to stop asking questions. It was around lunchtime. Michael stopped by the archives. I think Arthur's overdoing it. I noticed. He refuses to slow down. Have you talked to him? Michael laughed. For 15 years. Did it work? Not once. Sue. That afternoon, Arthur finally returned. He looked pale. You should go home. He smiled. I've heard that several times today. I'm adding my vote. Arthur sat down slowly. You know, I used to think retirement meant becoming unnecessary. And now, I think retirement means trusting someone else. I smiled. That sounds healthier. It is. Cute. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Then answered. Hello. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he hung up, his expression had changed. Everything okay? He smiled. Just test results. My stomach tightened. You don't have to tell me? I know. He looked at the city through the archive window. I've lived a wonderful life. I stared at him. Arthur. He turned back toward me. I'm not dying today. I didn't ask. No. You didn't. Late. That evening, Daniel arrived at Victoria's penthouse after another frustrating day. He expected dinner. Instead, he found boxes. Movers. Interior designers. What happened? Victoria barely looked up. We're renovating. Again. The West Wing feels outdated. Daniel looked around. The apartment had been renovated only 6 months earlier. It looked fine. Victoria shrugged. Fine isn't exceptional. He slowly set down his briefcase. Nothing was ever enough. Not the apartment. Not the furniture. Not the investments. Not even success itself. Everything constantly needed replacing. He suddenly remembered the little house he'd shared with Emily. They'd kept the same kitchen table for 11 years. Not because they couldn't afford another. Because every scratch carried a memory. The following morning, Emma called him before school. Daddy, sweetheart, are you coming to my school concert next Friday? Daniel smiled. Of course. You promise. His smile slowly faded. I promise. After hanging up, he sat quietly for several minutes. The word promise no longer felt as simple as it once had. Too late that afternoon, Arthur was preparing to leave when a sharp pain spread across his chest. It wasn't overwhelming. Just sudden. He steadied himself against his desk. Took a slow breath. Waited. The pain eased. He looked toward the emergency button beneath his desk. His finger hovered over it, then withdrew. Instead, he quietly picked up his coat. "I'll see my doctor tomorrow," he whispered to himself. Grace happened to walk past the office. She immediately noticed his face. "Arthur? I'm fine." She didn't believe him. "Sit down. I'm perfectly all right." "Arthur." Her voice became firmer. "Sit." Reluctantly, he lowered himself into the chair. Grace reached for the phone. "No." Arthur gently stopped her. "I don't need an ambulance." "You don't know that. I know my body." Grace looked directly into his eyes. "And I know you're scared." For the first time, Arthur didn't argue. He simply looked away. 30 minutes later, he finally agreed to let Grace drive him to the hospital for additional tests. As they left the building, I happened to be loading another archive box onto a cart. Arthur smiled reassuringly. "Routine checkup." I nodded. "I'll see you tomorrow." He smiled again. "I certainly hope so." I watched their car disappear into traffic. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain why. Only that, for the first time since meeting Arthur Whitmore, I was afraid. And hundreds of miles away, hidden safely inside a law firm's fireproof vault, a newly signed will waited silently, prepared, complete, ready for a future that suddenly seemed much closer than anyone wanted to believe. The phone rang at 6:17 the following morning. I was halfway through making Emma's breakfast. The coffee hadn't even finished brewing. I almost ignored the call. Almost. The number wasn't familiar. I answered anyway. "Hello? Or Mrs. Carter? Wes. This is Grace Holloway." Something in her voice made my heart sink. It wasn't panic. It was the careful, controlled tone people use when they're trying not to fall apart themselves. "Grace, I'm sorry to call so early." "Is Arthur all right?" Silence. Just 1 second. But it felt endless. "No." The spatula slipped from my hand and landed on the kitchen floor. Emma looked up from the table. "Mom." I couldn't answer. Grace continued quietly. "Arthur suffered a massive heart attack during the night. No, the doctors did everything they could." I closed my eyes. "Please, not Arthur. He passed away at 3:42 this morning." Everything around me seemed to stop. The kitchen, the ticking clock, the sounds outside the window, even my own breathing. Arthur Whitmore, the man who had quietly walked into a bookstore carrying an umbrella, was gone. "To Mrs. Carter." Grace's voice brought me back. "I'm here. He asked me to call you personally." My throat tightened. "He asked." "The day before yesterday. He left very specific instructions." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "I don't understand. He wanted you at the funeral, and there will be a reading of his will 3 days afterward. I don't think I belong there." Grace paused. "He specifically requested your presence." I stared at the wall. "Why?" Emma quietly walked over and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Mom, who's sick?" I looked down at her. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "Mr. Arthur." Her smile disappeared. "The man from the bookstore." I nodded. "The nice grandpa." Another nod. She hugged me tighter. "I'm sorry. Sometimes, children somehow know exactly what to say." The funeral took place 4 days later. Arthur had requested something simple. No television cameras, no political speeches, no extravagant displays of wealth. Just family, friends, employees, and the people he had loved. Nearly 2,000 people attended. Executives stood beside janitors. Receptionists stood beside board members. Retired warehouse workers embraced current interns. No one cared about titles. Everyone simply came to say goodbye. I sat quietly near the back of the church. Emma stayed with my mother. This felt like something I needed to do alone. Grace found me just before the service began. "I'm glad you came. I wouldn't have missed it." She smiled sadly. "He knew you wouldn't." The minister spoke briefly. Then Michael stepped to the podium. He looked far less composed than usual. I've worked beside Arthur Whitmore for 27 years. He paused. I've never met another man who remembered every employee's birthday. A gentle laughter spread through the church. He taught me something I'll never forget. Michael looked toward the thousands gathered before him. He used to say, "A company is only as successful as the people who go home smiling each night." Michael's voice broke. I hope we made him proud. D2, several retired employees shared stories. One spoke about Arthur personally delivering groceries during a factory strike. Another described Arthur paying for his daughter's college tuition after a workplace accident left the family struggling. Story after story. None had ever appeared in newspapers. Arthur had never spoken about any of them. Kindness performed quietly, exactly the way he preferred. After the service, people gathered outside beneath a gray autumn sky. Daniel stood several yards away beside Victoria. The moment I saw them, I frowned. Why were they here? Victoria noticed me first. She offered a polite nod. Daniel walked over. I'm sorry. For what? Arthur, you knew him. Daniel hesitated. Not personally. Victoria answered instead. Our families moved in similar business circles. Something about her tone felt different. Respectful. Measured. Almost cautious. Arthur was extraordinary, Victoria said quietly. He was. For the first time, there wasn't a trace of arrogance in her voice, only admiration. 2-3 days later, Grace called again. The reading is tomorrow. I still don't understand why I'm attending. I know. You will. That answer raised more questions than it answered. The following morning. Whitmore Holdings looked different. Black ribbons hung quietly in the lobby. Arthur's portrait stood beside hundreds of white lilies. Employees entered almost silently. The entire building seemed to be grieving. Grace met me near the elevators. Everyone's already upstairs. I feel out of place. She gently shook her head. No, you don't. The executive boardroom had been transformed. Long polished tables surrounded a single leather chair at the front. Arthur's chair, empty. Grace quietly motioned toward a seat near the middle. I looked around. Michael, board members, several distant relatives, foundation trustees, senior attorneys, even Daniel and Victoria. Daniel noticed me immediately. His expression was impossible to read. Confusion, curiosity, maybe both. Whispers filled the room. Who's she? Isn't that the archivist? I've seen her with Arthur. One elderly relative frowned openly. Why is an employee here? Grace ignored every comment. At exactly 10 o'clock, she stood. The room immediately became silent. As requested by Arthur James Whitmore. She began reading. His voice seemed to fill the room through her words. My friends, if you're hearing this, I've already taken my final walk. Several people quietly smiled. It sounded exactly like him. The first section covered charitable donations, millions allocated to hospitals, scholarship funds, veterans programs, children's literacy foundations. No one seemed surprised. Arthur had always been generous. Then came personal gifts, his antique watch collection, his library, his artwork, properties, vacation homes, everything carefully distributed. Several relatives relaxed. Clearly, they expected the company itself to remain within the family. Grace turned another page. The controlling interest of Whitmore Holdings. Every eye in the room lifted. Shall transfer according to the final instructions contained in Section 12. One attorney handed Grace another sealed envelope. The room became completely still. Even Daniel leaned forward. Victoria folded her hands. Michael quietly removed his glasses. Grace carefully opened the envelope. Before reading, she looked directly at me. Something about her expression made my pulse quicken. No, surely not. This couldn't involve me. Arthur had only known me for a few months. There were relatives in this room. Executives who had dedicated decades to the company. I was just Emily, the former bookstore employee, the temporary archivist. Nothing more. Grace unfolded the final document. She took a slow breath, then began reading. The majority ownership of Whitmore Holdings. Silence. Along with my controlling voting shares. Someone coughed nervously. Shall pass to... Grace looked directly at me. Emily Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The room simply froze. My own heart seemed to stop. I stared at Grace. Certain I had misunderstood. Certain she had read the wrong name. Across the table, Daniel's face turned completely white. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. Michael quietly smiled. Several relatives shot to their feet in disbelief. One elderly man shouted, "This has to be a mistake." Grace calmly lifted another document. "It is not." She looked around the room. "Arthur anticipated your objections." She placed a thick stack of handwritten letters onto the table. He explained every reason for his decision. The room erupted into shocked voices. But I couldn't hear any of them, because only one thought echoed inside my mind, Arthur. "What have you done?" Nobody spoke, for what felt like an eternity. The boardroom remained frozen. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was disbelief. Grace still stood at the front of the room, Arthur's signed will resting on the polished oak table before her. Across from me, one of Arthur's cousins slowly lowered himself back into his chair. "This," he whispered, "is impossible." Another relative shook her head. He barely knew her. A third slammed both hands onto the table. "I object." A Grace didn't flinch. "You may challenge the will through the courts." The attorney standing beside her calmly added, "Mr. Whitmore anticipated that possibility." He placed another thick binder on the table. "This contains over 6 months of documented meetings, medical evaluations confirming Mr. Whitmore's mental competency, video testimony, and written explanations for every decision." The room became quiet again. Arthur hadn't simply written a will. He had prepared for a battle. I finally found my voice. "There has to be a mistake." Every head turned toward me. Grace looked directly into my eyes. "There isn't. I don't want anyone else's inheritance. I never asked for this." "I know." Her answer was immediate. Arthur made certain everyone understood that. She opened another folder. "There is also a personal letter." My heart skipped. A letter. He instructed that it be read immediately after the will. Grace unfolded several handwritten pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's, elegant, steady, patient. She began reading. "To Seekers, if Emily is reacting the way I believe she will..." Grace smiled softly. "She is already trying to refuse." Several people slowly turned toward me. I felt my cheeks warm. Arthur knew me that well. Grace continued. "Emily, off. By the time you hear these words, I hope you've forgiven an old man for making your life considerably more complicated." A few quiet chuckles echoed through the room. It sounded exactly like Arthur. You never once asked me for money. You never asked for influence. You never asked for opportunity. You simply treated me as a lonely old man who loved books." I lowered my eyes. Memories flooded back. Coffee, conversations, history books, rainy afternoons inside the bookstore. None of it had ever felt important. Apparently, it had meant everything to Arthur. Grace continued reading. "When people discovered my name, they usually began asking what I could do for them." You asked what I was reading. That difference is larger than most people will ever understand. The room had become completely silent. Even Arthur's relatives were listening. "You reminded me that kindness still exists without expecting payment. You reminded me that compassion can survive disappointment. Most importantly, you reminded me of Evelyn." My eyes immediately filled with tears. Arthur had spoken about his wife so often. Never once had I imagined he saw any connection between us. "Not because you resemble her, no one ever could, but because both of you measured people by their hearts instead of their bank accounts." Test 2. Grace paused for a moment before continuing. If the greatest mistake wealthy people often make, Caesar's, is believing money should remain inside bloodlines regardless of character. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. I disagree. Money is a tool. The company is a responsibility. Neither should belong to someone merely because they share my last name. Arthur's cousin suddenly stood. This is outrageous. Grace calmly looked toward him. Please sit down. No, he insulted his own family. Grace quietly lifted another page. He anticipated that response as well. The cousin slowly sat. To my relatives, yes. Some of you will feel hurt. Some angry. Perhaps both. Please understand, I loved you. But loving someone does not automatically make them the right steward for something they did not build. And nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Arthur was still leading the room, even after his death. Grace turned another page. Emily. Whitmore Holdings does not belong to you. It belongs to the people whose livelihoods depend upon it. Sis. You are not receiving ownership. Sis. You are accepting stewardship. I quietly wiped away tears. Arthur hadn't left me wealth. He had left me responsibility. There was an enormous difference. Daniel hadn't moved since the reading began. His hands remained folded tightly together. His mind replayed conversation after conversation. Emily encouraging him when he doubted himself. Emily comforting Emma after nightmares. Emily helping neighbors without being asked. Emily staying late at work simply because someone needed help. He suddenly remembered something she'd once told him. People always matter more than money. He had laughed. He'd called her Nodvan. Now, one of America's most respected businessmen had built his entire legacy around the exact same belief. Daniel slowly closed his eyes. He hadn't left Emily because she lacked ambition. He had failed to recognize her greatest strength. Victoria remained unusually quiet. She wasn't angry. She wasn't jealous. She looked thoughtful. Very thoughtful. When Grace finished reading, Victoria quietly spoke. I understand. The room turned toward her. Arthur's cousin frowned. You understand this? Victoria nodded. I do. Why? She looked around the boardroom. I met Arthur twice. He spoke almost exclusively about integrity. She glanced toward Emily. I should have realized. The attorney stepped forward. There are additional instructions. He opened another folder. Mr. Whitmore requested that the executive board remain intact. Michael nodded. Understood. Mrs. Carter becomes chairwoman. Several board members exchanged glances. But the attorney continued. Daily operations remain under existing leadership until Mrs. Carter decides otherwise. Michael smiled. I think Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. I finally stood. I can't. Every eye turned toward me. I don't know how to run a multinational company. Grace smiled gently. Arthur addressed that too. She handed me one final envelope. Across the front, Arthur had written only 4 words. Read this first. You see, my hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, one handwritten page. Emily, the day you believe you already know everything, resign. Until then, Seth, surround yourself with people smarter than you. Listen more than you speak. Protect the company's values. The profits will follow. I already hired the express. I simply needed someone I could trust. That person is you. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The meeting ended quietly, not because everyone agreed. Far from it. Several relatives immediately informed their attorneys they intended to challenge the will. Reporters waiting outside had already heard rumors. Television crews gathered near the building entrance. Michael walked beside me toward Arthur's office. Are you all right? I shook my head. I don't think so. He smiled kindly. Neither am I. We entered Arthur's office together. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. The coffee mug, the reading glasses, The framed photograph of Evelyn, the chair beside the window. The room felt empty. Michael quietly picked up a small wooden box resting on Arthur's desk. He asked me to give you this. Inside lay the very first book Arthur had ever purchased from the bookstore. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. F. Every great story begins with someone who believes they aren't ready. Turn the page anyway. Shuai gently closed the book against my chest. Outside, camera flashes illuminated the lobby. News alerts spread across every major business network. One headline after another appeared across television screens. Haboke stoar empoe inasi rice bilaliom deal rempi if rear osrekar techuar daluyate timor siaki fiel dcizio eat door so as emir kemna rear 7. My life had changed forever. Not because I had become wealthy, but because an old man carrying an umbrella had once walked into a small bookstore and seen something in me, long before I ever saw it in myself. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By 8 o'clock the next morning, every major business network carried the same story. The Sesbo K-Star EMP Lo INH Rice BLIOM Dialar EMP RX Arshan WHO ICE EMH Card IROCAR SARTIA GMR Cars Fainel de Susayan South Seekes Wiles TRH Texas television analysts debated endlessly. Financial experts speculated. Social media exploded with theories. Some believed I had manipulated Arthur. Others insisted we had secretly been related. A few even suggested there had been a romantic relationship. The truth, the simplest explanation, was the one almost nobody believed. Arthur had simply trusted me. I stood in my kitchen staring at the television while butter slowly burned in the frying pan. Emma looked up from the breakfast table. Mom? Why are you on TV? I blinked. Sure enough, my photograph filled the screen. A reporter stood outside Whitmore Holdings. Little is known about Emily Carter, who worked at an independent bookstore before joining Whitmore Holdings just months ago. Emma smiled proudly. You're famous now. I quickly switched the television off. I don't think that's a good thing. My phone began vibrating. Again and again. Unknown numbers. Journalists. Former coworkers. People I hadn't spoken to in years. Some wanted interviews. Others wanted favors. Several simply wanted money. By 9 o'clock, I stopped answering completely. Grace arrived outside my house shortly afterward. We should probably leave. I was afraid you'd say that. She looked toward the reporters already gathering across the street. There are more at the office. I sighed. I haven't even started yet. You already have. Whitmore Holdings had become surrounded by media vans, satellite trucks, photographers, security barriers. As Grace's car approached the entrance, camera flashes exploded from every direction. I instinctively looked away. This is unbelievable. Grace smiled sympathetically. It'll calm down. When? She thought for a moment. Eventually. The ants inside. The atmosphere felt completely different. Employees applauded as I entered the lobby. I immediately shook my head. Please don't. The applause slowly faded. I haven't done anything. An older receptionist smiled warmly. You don't understand. What? We're applauding Arthur. I frowned. He believed in you. She placed her hand over her heart. That means something to all of us. What? I wasn't sure what to say. So? I simply thanked everyone. Michael met us near the elevators. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. I'm not ready. No one expects you to know everything. I don't know anything, Michael laughed. That's actually an advantage. The executive boardroom felt strangely empty without Arthur. His chair remained untouched. No one had moved it. No one wanted to. Michael quietly pulled out another chair beside his own. Sit here? I thought Arthur sat there. He did. And one day, Michael smiled. You'll choose where you want to sit. The meeting began with silence. Then Michael stood. Before we discuss business, I'd like everyone to remember why we're here. He looked toward Arthur's empty chair. We continue because he believed we could. Every board member quietly nodded. Tuba, the chief financial officer, began reviewing quarterly reports. Revenue, investments, expansion plans. Numbers filled enormous presentation screens. After 15 minutes, my head hurt. Arthur had never spoken like this. He had spoken about people, not percentages. Finally, Michael looked toward me. Questions. I laughed nervously. Too many. The room chuckled softly. I don't understand half these reports. No one expected you to. Michael smiled. What do you want to know? I looked around the table. One question. Go ahead. How many employees do we have? The room became unexpectedly quiet. The CFO answered, just over 28,000. I nodded slowly. And every decision we make affects all 28,000. Wes. I closed the financial report. Then, before every meeting, I'd like someone to remind us of that number. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. One board member smiled. Arthur used to say exactly the same thing. Another quietly nodded. So did his grandfather. Once, the meeting ended almost an hour later. As everyone gathered their papers, Michael remained seated. You did well. I barely spoke. You asked the most important question. Outside the boardroom, Grace approached carrying several folders. The legal challenges have already started. So, soon, she nodded. 3 relatives filed objections this morning. I wasn't surprised. Arthur had predicted it himself. Will they succeed? Grace smiled confidently. Numb. He prepared too well. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel watched another television interview. A financial commentator spoke confidently. Arthur Whitmore was famous for reading people better than balance sheets. If he chose Emily Carter, there was undoubtedly a reason. Daniel muted the television. Victoria entered carrying coffee. Vic talking about her again. He nodded. I know. Victoria quietly sat beside him. You still love her. Daniel looked up. What? She didn't sound angry, only honest. You still love Emily. He stared into his coffee. I don't know. Victoria smiled sadly. I think you do. Daniel didn't answer. Because, for the first time, he wasn't sure anymore. He had spent months convincing himself he had upgraded his life. Yet every day, he found himself remembering small things. Saturday morning pancakes. Movie nights on an old couch. Emma laughing while helping Emily bake cookies. Life hadn't been luxurious. It had simply been happy. Victoria looked toward the muted television. I misjudged her. Daniel frowned. You did? I assumed she was ordinary. She quietly smiled. So did everyone else? That afternoon, Emily entered Arthur's office alone. Everything remained untouched. His glasses still rested beside the leather notebook. His favorite fountain pen remained exactly where he'd left it. She slowly walked toward the bookshelf. A small framed photograph caught her attention. Arthur, Evelyn, and a little boy, their son. All smiling, she gently picked up the frame. So this was your world? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Michael stood in the doorway. I thought I'd find you here. I needed a minute. He nodded. So, did I? He walked over and looked at the photograph. I remember the day that was taken. You knew his family? I met them once. They were wonderful. He smiled sadly. Arthur never really recovered. Emily carefully returned the photograph to its place. I don't think anyone truly recovers from losing a child. No. Michael agreed quietly. They simply learned to carry the weight. Let them as they prepared to leave. Emily noticed another envelope tucked beneath Arthur's desk calendar. Her name appeared across the front. Michael smiled. I wondered when you'd find that. You knew. Arthur left several. She carefully opened it. Inside, only one handwritten sentence. Vars, never allow other people's opinions to become louder than your own conscience. Thus Emily smiled through fresh tears. Arthur was still teaching her. Even now. Too late that evening, the legal department delivered encouraging news. Grace entered the office carrying a thick folder. The first judge reviewed the initial challenge. Emily looked up hopefully. And Grace smiled. He dismissed it. So quickly? The court found Arthur's documentation overwhelming. She placed the ruling on the desk. He left absolutely nothing to chance. Emily quietly looked toward Arthur's empty chair. No, she whispered. He never did. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly beneath the office windows. Somewhere among those thousands of lights then, 28,000 employees were finishing another day's work. Families were eating dinner. Children were doing homework. Lives continued moving forward. Emily finally understood what Arthur had meant. Whitmore Holdings wasn't a fortune. It wasn't an empire. It was 28,000 families trusting strangers they'd never meet to make the right decisions tomorrow. And beginning the next morning, those decisions would belong to her. The first decision I made as chairwoman of Whitmore Holdings surprised everyone, including myself. I don't want Arthur's office. The executive committee stared at me. Michael looked genuinely confused. You don't? I shook my head. No. It should remain exactly as it is. Grace looked toward Arthur's empty office. As a memorial. Not just a memorial. I smiled softly. A reminder. The room remained quiet. I want every future executive who works here to walk through that office. I want them to remember the kind of person Arthur chose to be. Michael slowly smiled. I think he'd like that. Instead, I asked for a much smaller office on the same floor, one with ordinary furniture, a single bookshelf, a round meeting table, and windows overlooking the employee parking lot instead of the skyline. The facilities manager looked confused. Mrs. Carter? The executive suite has much better views. I know. I don't need better views. I pointed toward the parking lot below. I'd rather see the people who arrive every morning than the buildings downtown. By lunchtime, half the company knew about the decision. By evening, Arthur's old office had quietly become known as Press, the founder's room, just no one suggested changing it. T2 over the following weeks, my schedule became relentless. Board meetings, investor calls, legal briefings, foundation updates, interviews. I often worked 12-hour days. But every afternoon, without exception, I spent 30 minutes walking through a different department. No cameras, no speeches, just conversations. Arthur had called them hallway meetings. I intended to keep the tradition alive. One Tuesday, I wandered into the customer support department. A young employee looked startled. Mrs. Carter. Emily is fine. She laughed nervously. I've never met the chairwoman before. I've never been chairwoman before. That broke the tension immediately. Within minutes, people were telling me about broken coffee machines, outdated computers, ideas for improving customer service. Small problems, simple solutions. Nothing in the executive reports had mentioned any of it. Arthur had been right. The best information rarely arrived inside boardroom presentations. It lived in ordinary conversations. Michael joined me afterward. You've created a problem. I frowned. What kind of problem? Department managers are competing. For what? They all want you to visit next. I laughed. I can't possibly visit everyone. You'd better start trying. Meanwhile, the legal challenges continued. One by one, Arthur's relatives filed new objections. One claimed undue influence. Another questioned Arthur's mental health. A third argued that I had manipulated him. Each challenge failed. Arthur had anticipated every argument. Video recordings showed him calmly explaining his decisions. Independent physicians confirmed his mental clarity. Dozens of handwritten journals documented his thinking over several years. The courts dismissed challenge after challenge. Arthur had protected his final wishes as carefully as he'd built his company. 2. Across the city, Daniel's life was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Victoria entered the dining room, carrying another stack of investment reports. We're hosting Investors Friday night. Daniel barely looked up. I promised Emma I'd attend her school play Friday. Victoria stopped walking. You'll have to cancel. No. She blinked. I said no. The word surprised even him. Victoria slowly placed the reports on the table. The investors are flying in from London. My daughter has been practicing for 6 weeks. They'll understand. Emma won't. Silence settled over the room. Finally, Victoria spoke. I've never seen you like this. I haven't either. Friday evening arrived. Daniel drove to Emma's school. For the first time in months, he chose his daughter over business. He sat quietly in the third row while children nervously prepared behind the curtain. Then he noticed someone sitting a few seats away. Emily. She smiled politely. You came? I promised. Lights dimmed. Emma walked onto the stage. The moment she spotted both parents in the audience, her entire face lit up. She smiled so brightly that Daniel felt his chest tighten. It was such a small thing. Showing up. Yet somehow, it meant everything. After the performance, Emma ran toward them. You both came. She threw her arms around Daniel first. Then Emily. I wasn't nervous anymore because I saw you. Daniel looked at Emily. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Children measured love differently than adults. Not in expensive gifts. Not in impressive homes. Simply, who was there? As they walked toward the parking lot, Daniel finally spoke. I almost didn't come. Emily looked at him. What changed? I realized something. What? I've spent months trying to impress people whose opinions don't really matter. Emily remained silent. The only opinion I should have been worried about. He looked toward Emma walking ahead with her grandmother. Was hers. View. Back at the penthouse, Victoria sat alone. The investor dinner had gone perfectly. Everyone complimented the food, the presentations, the wine, the conversation. Yet, the empty chair beside her had become the only thing she noticed. She quietly poured herself another glass of sparkling water. For the first time, she wondered if success could still feel lonely. The following Monday, Grace entered my office carrying another sealed envelope. Arthur again? She smiled. The last one. I carefully opened it. Inside, there was only a folded photograph. Arthur, standing in front of the original bookstore where we'd first met. On the back, he had written one sentence. Never forget where your story truly began. I stared at the photograph for a long time. The bookstore. Mrs. Franklin. Rainy afternoons. Coffee. Conversations. Everything had started there. Not inside a skyscraper. Not inside a boardroom. Inside a quiet little bookstore where an elderly man looking for history books had unknowingly written my future. That afternoon, I drove there for the first time in weeks. The bell above the door chimed exactly as it always had. Mrs. Franklin looked up. Well, she smiled warmly. I was wondering when my favorite bookseller would come home. I laughed. I never really left. She walked around the counter and hugged me tightly. I've been watching you on television. I'm sorry. She laughed. You still apologize too much. I looked around the familiar shelves. Nothing had changed. The same worn wooden floors, the same smell of old paper, the same reading corner by the front window. For the first time in months, life felt wonderfully normal again. Mrs. Franklin handed me a freshly arrived novel. Arthur ordered this before he passed. My hands froze. He did. She nodded. He told me, Emily will know exactly what to do with it. I gently accepted the book. Arthur had somehow managed to leave me one final gift. Not money. Not advice. Just another story. Because he understood something better than almost anyone. Great fortunes eventually disappear. Companies rise and fall. Buildings are bought and sold. But stories have a way of changing people forever. And Arthur Whitmore's greatest story had only just begun to unfold through the lives he had left behind. 3 months passed. The headlines gradually disappeared. Television crews stopped waiting outside Whitmore Holdings. The reporters found newer stories, new scandals, new billionaires. For the first time since Arthur's will had been rid, life became quiet again. I welcomed the silence. Quiet gave people room to work. And Whitmore Holdings had never been stronger. Not because of me. Because Arthur had already surrounded the company with extraordinary people long before I arrived. I simply listened. Monday morning began with Michael placing the latest quarterly report on my desk. I think you'll like this. I opened the folder. Employee retention had increased. Customer satisfaction had reached its highest level in 12 years. Several charitable partnerships were exceeding expectations. Even profits had quietly improved. I looked up. We're doing well? Michael smiled. Very well. I thought everyone said kindness would hurt profitability. They did. And? He laughed. They've stopped saying it. Grace entered moments later carrying another folder. This isn't legal. I raised an eyebrow. Then what is it? She carefully placed the leather folder on my desk. It was found during renovations at Arthur's home. Across the front, Arthur's handwriting. For Emily. When you finally have time, I smiled. He knew me too well. You've delayed opening every letter. I wanted to be ready. Grace nodded. I think he knew that too. Titsu after she left. I carefully opened the folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages. Unlike his earlier notes, this wasn't advice. It was a journal. The first page simply read, This is one last conversation. Emily E.C. Sears. If you're reading this, you've probably spent several months believing I left you a company. See if I didn't I left you a responsibility. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Arthur. Money has always confused people. Some spend their entire lives chasing it. Others spend their lives protecting it. Very few ask what it should actually accomplish. I slowly turned the page. For I built Whitmore Holdings for one reason. Freedom. First, not freedom for me. Freedom for ordinary families. A steady paycheck. Healthcare. Education. Hope. If money cannot create those things, it becomes little more than numbers. There was another envelope tucked inside, smaller, sealed. Across the front, open after reading, I carefully unfolded the letter inside. It contained only one sentence. The basement archive contains one final project. I frowned. Basement archive. I had cataloged every room in the building. Or so I thought. I immediately called Michael. Can you come downstairs? Everything okay? I think Arthur left us homework. 10 minutes later, Michael, Grace, and I stood before a heavy steel door beneath the oldest section of Whitmore Holdings. I've never seen this. Michael admitted. Grace shook her head. Neither have I. The security manager unlocked the door using an old brass key found inside Arthur's desk. The lock clicked. The heavy door slowly opened. The lights automatically flickered on. We all stopped walking. The room wasn't a storage area. It was another archive, far larger than the first. Hundreds of carefully labeled boxes stretched across the room. Photographs, journals, blueprints, employee records, video interviews. Arthur had spent decades quietly preserving the company's soul. In the center of the room stood a single wooden table. Another envelope waited there. This time, all three of our names appeared on it. Emily, Grace, and Michael. I opened it. Arthur's handwriting greeted us once again. If you found this room, congratulations. You were curious enough to keep looking. Michael laughed. He knew us. Everything in this room belongs in a museum someday. Not because of me. Because ordinary people deserve to have their stories remembered. I looked around the room. Thousands of employee interviews. Retirement celebrations. Letters from families. Photographs from company picnics. Christmas parties, scholarship graduations. Arthur hadn't preserved his own legacy. He had preserved everyone else's. Grace quietly wiped away a tear. I never knew this existed. Michael slowly shook his head. He worked on this for years. I carefully picked up one video cassette. Across the label, Fisi Warehouse Employees. Christmas 1989. Another box contained handwritten letters from children thanking Whitmore Holdings for college scholarships. Another photographs of families standing beside their very first homes. Arthur hadn't measured success through acquisitions. He measured it through lives. Two tucked beneath the final folder. One last handwritten page. Emily. This room is my real inheritance. The money keeps the company alive. These stories explain why it deserves to live. Please, don't lock this room away. Let people remember. Second, that afternoon, I gathered the executive committee. Instead of meeting in the boardroom, I led them downstairs. No presentations, no financial reports, only Arthur's hidden archive. For nearly 2 hours, nobody spoke. Executives quietly walked between shelves reading old letters, looking at photographs, watching employee interviews. One senior vice president finally broke the silence. I've worked here 26 years. I never understood this company until today. Another executive nodded. Neither did I. Michael looked toward me. What now? I smiled. We finish Arthur's dream. Within days, architects arrived, not to renovate executive offices, to transform the hidden archive into something entirely different. A permanent Whitmore Heritage Center, part museum, part research library, part educational center, open to employees, their families, local schools, the public. Arthur had wanted history to inspire people. Now it finally could. Meanwhile, Daniel's own life continued unraveling. Victoria entered the penthouse carrying legal documents. I've accepted a position in London. Daniel looked up. For how long? Indefinitely. He stared at her. And us. Victoria quietly sat across from him. I think. She paused. We wanted different things. He almost laughed. Those exact words. The same words he'd once spoken to Emily. Life had a strange sense of irony. 2. I'm not angry. Victoria continued. Neither am I. You deserve someone who enjoys this world. She looked around the luxurious apartment. I don't think you ever really did. Daniel nodded slowly. Perhaps she was right. He hadn't wanted luxury. He had wanted significance. Unfortunately, he hadn't realized the difference until it was too late. That weekend, Daniel asked if he could speak privately with Emily after dropping Emma home. She agreed. They stood quietly beneath the old maple tree in the front yard. I've been thinking. Emily smiled faintly. I can see that. I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. Daniel looked directly into her eyes. I left because I believed money would make my life better. Emily remained silent. I confused wealth with happiness. He took a slow breath. I spent years believing you lacked ambition. His voice cracked slightly. I finally understand. Emily waited patiently. You weren't chasing money, you were chasing peace. Emily smiled sadly. I was chasing a family. Daniel lowered his head. I know. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily gently broke the silence. I've forgiven you. Daniel looked up. You have. I forgave you months ago. Why? Because carrying resentment only keeps old wounds alive. He swallowed hard. Does that mean? She softly shook her head before he could finish. Nope. I forgave you. I didn't forget. Daniel closed his eyes. He had expected that answer. It still hurt. But somehow, it also felt fair. That evening, Emily returned to Whitmore Holdings alone. She walked through the nearly completed Heritage Center. Workers carefully mounted Arthur's favorite quote above the entrance. She smiled as she read it. X. Success is measured by the number of lives made better because you were here. As she quietly looked toward Arthur's portrait, You were right. The building felt peaceful. Not because it was finished, because Arthur's final dream was finally becoming reality. The grand opening of the Whitmore Heritage Center took place on the first Saturday in April. Arthur would have hated the attention, which was exactly why I insisted on keeping the ceremony simple. No celebrity host, no elaborate stage, no fireworks. Just employees, their families, former workers, students, and one ribbon stretched across the entrance. As I stood outside the restored building, I couldn't help smiling. 6 months earlier, I had been worried about losing my home. Now, I was opening a museum dedicated to preserving the stories of thousands of ordinary people. Life truly had an unbelievable way of changing direction. Tuka Michael adjusted his tie as he joined me. Nervous. A little? You've spoken in front of investors. I'd rather face investors. He laughed. They don't ask difficult questions. No, Tub. They just ask expensive ones. He too walked over carrying a small wooden box. I found this while we were finishing Arthur's office. What is it? She handed it to me. Inside rested an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Written in Arthur's handwriting. Bookstore. I looked up. The bookstore. Grace smiled. He owned the building. I stared at her. What? He bought it years ago. I didn't know. No one did. Mrs. Franklin paid almost no rent. Arthur quietly reduced it every few years. I felt tears forming. He never told her. Grace shook her head. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted the bookstore to survive. I laughed softly. Of course he did. The ceremony began exactly at 10. Instead of executives speaking first, I invited retired warehouse employee Harold Jenkins to the podium. He was 83 years old. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. I worked for Whitmore Holdings for 47 years. He smiled. I never imagined I'd live long enough to see someone build a museum for people like us. His voice broke. We weren't famous. We weren't rich. We just came to work. He looked around the crowd. Arthur believed ordinary lives deserved remembering. A herald pointed toward the entrance. Today, they always will be. The applause lasted nearly a minute. Instead of cutting the ribbon myself, I handed the scissors to Harold. You earned this. He looked stunned. No. I couldn't. Yes. You can. With tears filling his eyes, he carefully cut the ribbon. The crowd applauded again. It felt exactly like something Arthur would have done. Inside, families wandered through decades of company history. Children watched old interviews on interactive displays. Retired employees pointed at photographs of themselves taken 40 years earlier. Laughter echoed through every room. One elderly woman hugged me tightly. My husband passed away 10 years ago. She pointed toward a photograph displayed on the wall. Our grandchildren finally get to see where he spent his life. She smiled through tears. Thank you. I gently squeezed her hand. You should thank Arthur. She shook her head. He trusted the right person. Later that afternoon, Emma walked beside me through the museum. She stopped in front of a display showing Arthur as a young man standing outside the original warehouse. He looks happy. Do you miss him? Every day. She looked at me thoughtfully. I think he still talks to you. I smiled. How? You keep doing what he would do. Children sometimes explained complicated things with astonishing simplicity. Maybe she was right. Across town, Daniel sat alone inside a small apartment. The penthouse was gone. Victoria had moved to London 3 weeks earlier. Their relationship had ended quietly. Without arguments, without drama, simply, with honesty. He now rented a modest apartment not much larger than the first place he and Emily had shared years ago. Ironically, it felt more like home than the penthouse ever had. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. Dad, can you come to the museum tomorrow? I want to show you something. But want to sing us? Daniel smiled. Wouldn't miss it.
Yeah.
The next afternoon, Daniel arrived at the Heritage Center. He walked slowly through the exhibits, photographs, letters, employee interviews. One display immediately caught his attention. Arthur's philosophy of leadership. Across the wall, large silver letters read, "Character creates wealth that money never can." Daniel stood staring at the quote for a long time. It described Emily perfectly, and it described him painfully well. Amma grabbed his hand. "Daddy, I want to show you something." She pulled him toward another exhibit. Behind the glass rested Arthur's first bookstore receipt. The customer name read Arthur Whitmore. The clerk's signature beneath it, Emily Carter. Daniel smiled sadly. "So that's where it all started." Emma nodded proudly. "Mom says stories can change people's lives." "They can," he quietly replied. "They really can." As Daniel prepared to leave, he found Emily standing alone outside the museum gardens. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he smiled. "I think Arthur would be proud." Emily looked toward the building. "I hope so." Daniel hesitated. "I've wanted to ask you something." She nodded. "What? Are you happy?" She thought about the question much longer than he expected. Finally, she smiled. "Yes." Not because of the money. Not because of the company. Because I finally understand who I am. Daniel lowered his eyes. "I'm glad. And you?" He smiled faintly. "I'm learning." I started volunteering. Emily looked pleasantly surprised, really. Every Saturday. At the Community Literacy Center, she laughed softly. I know. I needed somewhere to start." Emily smiled warmly. "Arthur would have liked that." "I hope so." A few weeks later, Whitmore Holdings held its annual shareholder meeting. It was Emily's first full year as chairwoman. Investors packed the auditorium expecting discussions about profits, growth, expansion. Instead, Emily began differently. She stepped to the podium. No notes, no teleprompter. Only Arthur's old fountain pen resting in her hand. "I'd like to begin with a story." Several investors looked surprised. She smiled. "A year ago, I worked in a bookstore." A gentle laughter spread through the audience. "I thought success meant surviving." She paused. "Arthur Whitmore taught me something different. He taught me success means helping other people survive." The room became completely silent. She continued. "This year, Whitmore Holdings reported record profits." Polite applause followed. Emily raised a hand. "But that's not what makes me proud." She looked toward the employees seated in the back rows. "What makes me proud, Toro, is that 28,000 families went home knowing someone cared about them." This time, the applause wasn't polite, it was heartfelt. Many people stood, others wiped away tears. Michael looked toward Grace. "He did it again." Grace smiled. "No." She did. That evening, Beverly returned one last time to Arthur's office. The room remained exactly as he had left it. She placed his fountain pen beside the photograph of Evelyn, then quietly whispered, "You were right." Outside, employees laughed while leaving work. Families waited in the parking lot. Children climbed into cars. Life continued. Exactly as Arthur had hoped. His company was still growing. His values were still alive. And the woman who once believed she'd lost everything had discovered that the greatest inheritance in the world was never the money. It was becoming the kind of person worthy of receiving it. 1 year later, the bookstore bell rang exactly the way it always had. Soft, familiar, comforting. I smiled the moment I stepped inside. Mrs. Franklin looked up from behind the register and laughed. I was beginning to think billion-dollar chairwomen had forgotten old bookstores. "I don't think that's possible." She walked around the counter and hugged me. "You still smell like coffee." "I drink too much of it." Arthur would approve. We both laughed. Some names still brought sadness. But now, the sadness came wrapped in gratitude. The bookstore hadn't changed. The same worn wooden shelves. The same reading corner by the front window. The same old clock that always ran 3 minutes slow. Children wandered through the picture books. An elderly couple argued playfully over mystery novels. A college student sat in the corner highlighting textbooks. Life moved exactly as it always had. It reminded me of something Arthur once said. The world doesn't need every place to become bigger. Seek us. Some places simply need to remain kind. XU to Mrs. Franklin poured 2 cups of coffee. I've been watching the news. I try not to. They say Whitmore Holdings has become one of the best companies in the country to work for. I smiled. They're giving me too much credit. She shook her head. No. They're giving credit where it belongs. I've simply continued Arthur's work. And that's harder than starting your own. Bulls and I looked around the bookstore. You know, I almost lost everything. Mrs. Franklin smiled knowingly. No. You almost lost the things that never really belonged to you. I frowned. What do you mean? You thought your marriage defined you. You thought your house defined you. You thought your job defined you. Well, she gently placed a fresh novel on the counter. The woman standing here today was always inside you. You just couldn't see her yet. I stood quietly. Sometimes, the people who know us longest see us most clearly. To that afternoon, Whitmore Holdings hosted its annual Family Day. More than 30,000 employees and their families gathered across the company campus. Children painted murals. Food trucks lined the walkways. Retired employees shared stories with new hires. Scholarship recipients met the donors whose generosity had changed their lives. There wasn't a single luxury display. No extravagant stage. No celebrity entertainment. Just people. Exactly the way Arthur would have wanted. 2. Michael joined me near the entrance. Attendance keeps breaking records. I think people were waiting for something like this. They were. He smiled. You know, the board took another vote yesterday. I looked at him. Vote. Whether to renew your appointment. My stomach tightened. You didn't tell me? I wanted today to stay about families. So, Michael laughed. It was unanimous. I blinked. Unanimous? Every single vote. He extended his hand. Congratulations, Chairwoman. I smiled. Thank you. No. Michael shook his head. Thank you. Due to later that afternoon, Grace found me standing inside the Heritage Center. I have something. She handed me a small velvet box. I found it while cataloging Arthur's personal effects. I carefully opened it. Inside was the old brass bookstore key. Attached was another tiny handwritten note I had somehow missed. Eth, when you no longer need this key, Eth, give it to someone else who believes stories matter. I smiled through tears. Arthur was still thinking about the future, even in the smallest things. Tootlet across town. Daniel parked outside the Community Literacy Center. Every Saturday morning, he spent 4 hours helping adults learn to read. It had started as an attempt to become a better father. Now, it had become something he genuinely loved. An older volunteer walked over. Morning, Daniel. Morning. We've got 3 new students today. Daniel smiled. Let's get started. He had lost the marriage. He had lost the life he thought he wanted, but he had finally found purpose. Not every ending had to be punishment. Sometimes, it simply became a lesson. To that evening, Daniel drove Emma home after spending the afternoon together. As they stopped outside Emily's house, Emma smiled. I had fun. So did I. She hugged him tightly. I like this. What? Everyone being nice again. Daniel looked toward the house where Emily waited on the porch. So do I. Emma ran inside. Daniel walked toward Emily. I wanted to tell you something. She smiled. I'm listening. I got promoted. Congratulations. It's not a huge job, but... He laughed. It's honest. And I actually enjoy it. Emily genuinely smiled. I'm happy for you. I finally understand something. What? I kept chasing the life other people admired. He looked toward Emma laughing through the living room window. I should have been building the life my daughter would remember. Emily nodded. She's already proud of you. You think so? I know so. Daniel hesitated. I don't expect another chance. Emily smiled kindly. I know. I just wanted you to know. I'm grateful. For what? For the years we had. For Emma. For teaching me things I was too foolish to appreciate. Emily reached out and gently squeezed his hand. I hope you have a good life, Daniel. He smiled. You too. There was no bitterness, no anger, only acceptance. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't restore a relationship. It simply allows two people to stop carrying the weight of the past. Key months later, the Whitmore Heritage Center welcomed its 1 millionth visitor. A little girl from a local elementary school. She looked around the museum with wide eyes. Who was Arthur Whitmore? The tour guide smiled. He was a businessman. The little girl nodded. Was he rich? The guide looked toward Arthur's portrait, then toward the photographs of thousands of employees lining the walls. He was. She smiled. But not because of his money. The toot evening. After everyone had gone home, I walked alone through the quiet Heritage Center. I stopped before Arthur's portrait. Below it, his favorite quote had been engraved into polished stone. Success is measured by the number of lives made better because you were here. I smiled. You did well, Arthur. For just a moment, I imagined him standing beside me with his umbrella tucked beneath one arm, smiling that quiet smile. As if to say worse, turn the page. When Daniel left me, I thought I had lost everything. My marriage, my future, my security, my confidence. I couldn't have been more wrong. What I actually lost was the life that was too small for the person I was becoming. Arthur didn't give me wealth. He gave me belief. He didn't leave me an empire. He left me a purpose. And in the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't Whitmore Holdings. It wasn't the buildings, the investments, or the fortune. The greatest inheritance was learning that true wealth is measured by the lives you lift, the kindness you leave behind, and the legacy that continues long after you're gone. That was everything. Thank you for joining Emily's journey. If this story moved you, share in the comments which moment touched you the most, and whether you think Arthur made the right decision with his final will. If you enjoy heartfelt stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story on Between Raindrops Stories.